The morning Marguerite turned 34, she did not celebrate with a party or a cake. She sat on the small balcony of her flat in the east end of the city, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, holding a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold, and she watched the street below come alive. A delivery man argued quietly with his bicycle chain. A woman in a yellow coat walked a tiny dog that kept stopping to sniff every crack in the pavement. A boy ran past with a school bag bouncing on his shoulders, late and unconcerned about it. Marguerite watched all of this and felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. Satisfaction maybe, or the particular peace that comes when a person stops wanting their life to look different and starts paying attention to what it actually is. She had grown up in a small town called Weston, about 2 hours north of the city by train. Weston was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your mother's name, your grandmother's name, and they all had opinions about what you should do with your life. The town had one main street, 2 churches, a post office that smelled of cardboard, and a bakery run by a man called Owen who made extraordinary cinnamon rolls that he refused to sell before 8 in the morning, no matter how early you arrived or how nicely you asked. Marguerite's mother, Elaine, had worked at the post office for 22 years. She was a steady, practical woman who believed in saving money, saying what you meant, and getting to bed by 10. She was not a woman who talked about feelings very often, but she showed love in the most reliable ways. A packed lunch left on the kitchen counter every morning without fail, a coat always waiting by the door when the weather turned cold, and a particular way of looking at Marguerite when something had gone wrong at school that said, without words, that everything was going to be all right. Marguerite's father, Gerald, had left when she was 9. Not dramatically. He had not shouted or broken things. He had simply, one Tuesday morning, told Elaine that he was going to visit his brother in the north and had never come back. He sent a card at Christmas for a few years, and then stopped. Marguerite had spent a portion of her childhood waiting for something from him, a letter, a visit, an explanation, and had eventually, around the age of 15, stopped waiting. The waiting had been exhausting. Stopping it had felt like putting down a heavy bag she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. She had been a good student, not brilliant in the way that made teachers nervous, but steady and curious and determined. She read everything she could find. She was particularly drawn to stories, novels, biographies, newspaper articles, anything with a human being at the center of it trying to figure out how to live. She had a teacher in secondary school, a tall, dry man called Mr. Holt, who had told her once after she had turned in an essay about a novel they were studying, that she had a gift for seeing what things actually meant beneath what they appeared to mean. She had carried that comment with her for years the way some people carry a lucky coin. She had come to the city at 18 to study literature at the university. She had arrived with one suitcase, a second-hand laptop, and the conviction that she was going to be fine. The conviction turned out to be correct, though the path to being fine was considerably less straightforward than she had imagined. Her first year had been hard. She had been lonely in the way that is particular to being surrounded by people and not yet knowing any of them. She had struggled with money. She had called her mother too often and not often enough at different times. She had got a part-time job at a bookshop that paid almost nothing and was the best job she had ever had. The bookshop was called Fielding's. It occupied a narrow building on a street near the university that always smelled of old paper and something faintly like cedar. The owner was a woman named Patricia Fielding, who was 60-something and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had strong opinions about everything: authors, tea, the correct way to shelve fiction, the inexcusable rudeness of people who bent the spines of paperbacks. Patricia had hired Marguerite after a 5-minute conversation and had told her that she would be paid in cash and that if she ever reorganized the shelves without permission, she would be immediately dismissed. Marguerite had loved every hour she spent in that shop. She had loved the customers who came in knowing exactly what they wanted and the customers who came in not knowing at all, and the process of helping both kinds find what they were looking for. She had loved the rainy afternoons when no one came in, and she and Patricia sat at opposite ends of the shop reading their own books in comfortable silence. She had loved the regulars, the retired professor who came every Thursday for a new mystery novel, the teenage girl who came on Saturdays and always asked Marguerite what she was reading that week, the elderly man who bought books for his wife who was ill at home and could not come herself, and who always asked Marguerite to choose something for him because his wife had once told him that Marguerite had good taste. She graduated after 4 years with a good degree and no clear idea of what to do next. This was, Patricia told her, perfectly normal, and probably a sign that she was a person who thought seriously about things. She stayed in the city. She got another job, administrative work at a small arts charity, and slowly built a life. She moved into a better flat. She made friends. She began, gradually and with considerable trial and error, to understand what she was actually good at, and what she cared about, and what kind of life she wanted to be building. She was 26 when she started writing. Not fiction. She had tried fiction, and found that she kept getting in her own way, too aware of every sentence to let the story move freely. What came naturally was something more personal. She began writing essays, long pieces about things she had observed or experienced or thought deeply about. The way cities change when you walk them at different hours of the day. The particular loneliness of being in a crowd. What it feels like to grow up without one of your parents and how the shape of that absence shifts and reshapes itself over the years. How books had saved her in ways she could not fully explain. She started a small blog and wrote on it irregularly and with no particular ambition. The blog was read, at first, by no one except her friend Clara, who had been her closest friend since they had lived in the same university hall of residence in their first year. Clara was a journalist, sharp and warm in equal measure, and she read Marguerite's essays with the focused attention of someone who recognized something real when they encountered it. One day Clara sent a link to one of Marguerite's essays to a magazine editor she knew, without telling Marguerite she was going to do it. The editor wrote to Marguerite 3 days later and asked if she had more work. She did. Over the following year, she had pieces published in 3 different publications. They were not large publications. They did not make her famous or wealthy. But people read them. Real people who wrote to her afterward to say that something she had written had made them feel less alone in some way they could not quite name. That correspondence, those messages from strangers, moved her more than any professional recognition could have. By the time she was 30, Marguerite was working as a writer and editor at a small cultural magazine called The Margin. She was not wealthy. She was careful with money in the way her mother had taught her to be. She lived simply, spent on things that mattered to her. Good food, a few good pieces of clothing, books, and saved what she could. She had a modest flat that she had made genuinely comfortable. She had a handful of deep friendships and a wider circle of people she was glad to know. She had work she believed in. She had a life she had built herself, without help from a father who had left on a Tuesday morning and never explained himself, without the safety net of wealth or connection, or the kind of family name that opened doors before you even knocked. She was not without her difficulties. She carried the quieter kind of sadness that many people who have had to grow up quickly carry, a certain watchfulness, a habit of waiting for things to go wrong, an occasional difficulty in believing that good things were simply good without some catch hidden inside them. She had been in 2 significant relationships. The first, in her mid-20s, had ended slowly and without much anger, and had left her with a bruised heart and a better understanding of what she actually needed from another person. The second, at 29, had ended more quickly and more painfully, and she had spent a season afterward rebuilding herself with the same steady care she brought to everything. She was not, by 34, someone who had everything she might have wanted. She had not yet found a lasting partnership. She did not have the kind of professional recognition that she sometimes, quietly, felt she had earned. There were rooms she had walked into and sensed, almost immediately, that certain people in those rooms had already decided she was not quite what they were looking for, without knowing anything about her. She had felt the particular discomfort of being underestimated, mistaken for someone simpler, someone less capable, someone more easily placed into a small and tidy box. But she had also learned something that not everyone learns, that how other people see you and who you actually are can be 2 very different things, and that the gap between those 2 things is not your responsibility to close on their behalf. She had learned to hold her own sense of herself more steadily, not with arrogance. She was not an arrogant woman, but with a kind of quiet groundedness that had taken years to develop and that she protected carefully because she knew how long it had taken to build. On the morning she turned 34, sitting on her balcony with her cold tea, watching the street below, she thought about none of this in a particularly organized way. It was more a feeling than a thought, a sense of herself as someone solid, someone real, someone who had made it this far under her own power and who was, for the most part, genuinely glad to be the person she had become. Her phone lit up on the small table beside her. A message from Clara. "Happy birthday. Are you awake? I have something to tell you. Also, I'm bringing pastries in an hour, so be dressed." Marguerite smiled. She picked up her phone and typed back, "Already awake. Bring the ones with the almond filling. And tell me now, or I'll be thinking about it for the whole hour." Clara replied immediately, "Put on your nice dress. I've got us an invitation." Marguerite looked at the phone for a moment. Then she looked back at the street below, where the boy with the bouncing school bag had vanished around the corner, and the woman in the yellow coat was now trying to convince her small dog that the pavement crack was not worth another 30 seconds of investigation. She typed back, "What kind of invitation?" Clara's reply came in pieces, the way she always texted when she was excited about something. "A charity ball. This weekend, Lord somebody or other is hosting. Lots of interesting people. The sculptor Noel Whitfield will be there. I know you love his work. Also, the food is meant to be extraordinary. And before you say anything, yes, you should go. Yes, it will be good for you. And no, I won't hear any arguments until I've seen the pastries. Marguerite read the message twice. She felt the familiar small flutter of hesitation, a gathering of reasons why it might not be worth it, why she might not fit, why it was possibly not the kind of room she was meant to walk into. She recognized the feeling. She had felt it many times before. She had learned that it was not always wrong, but that it was also not always right, and that the only reliable way to know the difference was to go and find out. She typed back, "Fine, but if it's terrible, I'm leaving early and you're buying me dinner afterward." Clara sent back 3 small laughing faces and a cake emoji. Then, "Be downstairs in an hour. I'm bringing the almond ones." Marguerite stood up, tucking the blanket around the chair. The tea had gone completely cold. She poured it over the edge of the balcony onto the small patch of earth below where she kept trying, with limited success, to grow mint. She went inside to shower and get dressed and prepare herself for whatever Clara was about to walk through her door with. She did not know, standing in her small bathroom with the water running warm and the sounds of the city coming through the slightly open window, that the following Saturday night was going to mark something. She did not know that she was about to walk into a room that would, in ways she could not yet predict, change the direction of her life, not by breaking her, but by making something in her finally, irreversibly clear. She did not know any of this. She was simply a woman getting ready on her birthday morning, thinking about almond pastries and whether she had anything suitable to wear to a charity ball. Outside, the street went on doing what it always did. The mint below the balcony received its cold tea and asked for nothing in return. And the day moved forward the way days do, without asking whether you are ready, without slowing down to check whether you have prepared for what is coming. It simply arrives. And you decide, in the moment of arrival, who you are going to be inside it. Marguerite had been deciding who she was going to be for 34 years. She was, by the morning of her birthday, remarkably good at it. Clara arrived exactly 58 minutes after her text, which for Clara was practically early. She came through the door with a brown paper bag from the bakery on Clement Street, 2 cardboard cups of coffee balanced against her chest, and the particular energy she always carried when she was convinced she had done something good. She was a small, quick woman, with dark hair cut short, and a habit of talking with her hands that made every conversation feel slightly like a performance. Marguerite had loved her since the 2nd week of their first year at university, when Clara had knocked on her door at 11 at night to ask if she had any paracetamol, and had stayed for 3 hours because they had somehow got onto the subject of whether honesty was actually kind or simply comfortable, and neither of them had wanted to stop talking. Clara set the coffee and the bag on the kitchen counter and turned to look at Marguerite, who was standing in the doorway of the bedroom in a navy dress she had owned for 5 years and still genuinely liked. "You look good," Clara said, with the straightforwardness of someone who would also tell you if you did not. "Thank you," Marguerite said. "Tell me about this ball." Clara opened the paper bag and handed her a pastry. "Eat first. I find you make better decisions when you're not hungry." "I've already made the decision. You said yes on my behalf via text message." "That's true. Still, eat first." Marguerite sat at the kitchen table and ate. The almond pastry was very good. Outside, the city went on. Clara told her about it while they drank their coffee. The ball was being held on Saturday evening at Harwick House, one of those grand old buildings in the center of the city that opened its doors a few times a year for events of this kind. It was a charity event, funds being raised for a children's medical program that Marguerite had actually written a short piece about the previous year. The guest list was, according to Clara's contact, a mixture of wealthy donors, artists, journalists, and the kind of titled individuals who moved through the city's more formal social circles as though they had been born knowing the choreography of such evenings, which in many cases they had been. The sculptor Noel Whitfield would be there. Marguerite had admired his work for years. He made large, deceptively simple pieces from stone and iron that seemed to hold something, a quality of stillness, of listening, that she had never quite been able to describe in words, though she had tried once in an essay that she was still not entirely satisfied with. He had been profiled once in the margin, before her time there, and she had read the profile 3 times. "How did you get the invitation?" Marguerite asked. "Through Edward," Clara said. Edward was Clara's colleague at the newspaper, a tall, cheerful man with a talent for being invited to things. "He had 2+1s and his wife is away this weekend. He offered them to me." "He offered you 2+1s because his wife is away. He is a generous man," Clara said, in a tone that said she had the same thought, and was choosing to proceed anyway. "Who are the other guests likely to be?" Clara listed them as best she could from what Edward had told her. a baroness who sat on the board of several cultural institutions and who was, by all accounts, formidably intelligent, a painter whose recent exhibition had caused considerable argument in the press, 2 or 3 politicians of varying levels of current relevance, a group of people from the financial sector whose names meant nothing to Marguerite but evidently meant a great deal in certain rooms, and Lord Ashfield. Clara mentioned this name somewhat carefully, watching Marguerite's face as she said it, who was hosting alongside the charity's official board. Lord Ashfield was the sort of name Marguerite had encountered in the margins of various social pages she had skimmed without much interest. Old title, old family, old money that had not yet run out. She had no particular feeling about him in either direction. "I don't have the right dress," Marguerite said, which was her last attempt at a practical reason not to go. Clara looked at her in the navy dress. "That one is fine. For a charity ball at Harwick House?" "Yes." "You haven't seen Harwick House?" "I've seen photographs. You look perfectly fine. Also, I have a wrap you can borrow that will elevate the whole thing considerably. It's emerald green. It will suit you." Marguerite looked at her for a moment. Clara held the gaze with the easy confidence of someone who had already factored in all probable objections and dismissed them in advance. "All right," Marguerite said. "What time Saturday?" 8. "Edward will drive us." Edward with the generous +1s. "The very same." Marguerite finished her coffee. The morning was bright now, the early gray having cleared, and light came through the kitchen window in a long stripe across the floor. She thought about Noel Whitfield's sculptures. She thought about the children's medical program and how she had felt, writing about it, a genuine conviction that the work it did mattered. She thought about the Baroness, who was apparently formidably intelligent. She thought about the emerald green wrap. "Thank you for the pastry," she said, "and for the invitation, and for deciding for me before I could talk myself out of it." "That," Clara said, folding up the paper bag, "is what best friends are for." They spent the rest of the birthday morning the way they often spent their mornings together, talking about everything, moving easily from the serious to the trivial and back again, the way people do when they know each other well enough to trust that none of the subject changes will seem careless. Clara told her about a story she was working on at the newspaper. Marguerite told her about an essay she had been thinking about writing for months but had not yet found the right way into. They talked about a book they had both recently read and agreed on almost nothing about, which was usual and pleasant. By early afternoon, Clara had to leave. She stood in the doorway pulling on her jacket and said, with the simplicity of someone who did not make declarations very often but meant every one when she did, "I'm glad you're here, that you're still here, and that you built what you built. Happy birthday." Marguerite felt something move in her chest. "Go on," she said, "before you make me emotional and I have to pretend I'm not." Clara laughed and left. Marguerite stood in the quiet of the flat for a while. Then she went to her desk and opened her notebook, a habit she had kept for years, this daily practice of writing down not events but impressions, feelings, small observations. And she wrote, without planning to, a single line. She wrote, "I think I am ready for whatever comes next, and I do not need it to be gentle." She looked at the line for a long time, then she closed the notebook and went to make herself another cup of tea, this one hot enough to actually drink. Saturday was coming. The ball was coming. And Marguerite, who had spent 34 years learning to be exactly herself, was going to walk into it with her head up and her eyes open, wearing a navy dress and an emerald green wrap borrowed from her best friend, ready for whatever a room full of strangers might hold. She did not need it to be kind to her. She was not expecting it to be. She was simply expecting it to be real, and she had long since learned how to handle real things. The week before the ball moved the way weeks move when there is something at the end of them that your mind keeps returning to. Marguerite went about her ordinary routines, editing pieces at the margin, responding to emails, cooking simple dinners in her kitchen, walking through the city in the evenings when the weather was mild enough, and through all of it, underneath the surface of her normal days, there ran a thin current of anticipation that was not entirely comfortable. She was not someone who enjoyed events of this kind. That was the honest truth of it. She had been to enough of them, over the years, to know that they required a particular kind of energy, a social performance that she could carry off well enough, but that cost her something, left her slightly depleted afterward, in a way that a quiet evening at home did not. The rooms were usually beautiful and the food was usually good, and the conversations were a mixed result. Sometimes you found yourself talking to someone genuinely interesting, and the evening became something unexpected and worthwhile. More often you moved through exchanges that were cordial and forgettable, sustained by a kind of mutual politeness that both parties understood required no particular investment. She mentioned this to her colleague Owen on Wednesday, not Owen from the bakery in Weston, but a different Owen, younger, who worked at the margin as a photographer, and who had a gift for listening that was unusual in anyone, and particularly unusual in someone 26 years old. They were eating lunch at their desks, as they often did, and Owen had asked how her birthday had been, and she had told him about the ball, and then been more honest about her mixed feelings than she had intended. Owen listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had always liked about him. He ate half his sandwich and thought about what she had said and then said, "Is it the room you don't like, or the being seen in the room?" Marguerite looked at him. "What's the difference? If you don't like the room, you go and endure it and come home and you've done something decent for a children's charity. If it's the being seen that bothers you, that's a different thing. That's worth thinking about." She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it on her walk home that evening, through the part of the city where the streets narrowed and the buildings were old and leaned slightly toward each other as though sharing a secret. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath. Did it bother her, being seen in a room like that one? By people who would look at her and make quick judgments based on whatever limited information was available to them? The honest answer was, yes, a little. Not in a way that would stop her going, but yes. She had been in rooms before where she had felt the particular sensation of being assessed and found slightly confusing to the people doing the assessing. She did not look the way some people expected a writer to look. She was not loud or dramatic. She did not name drop or position herself cleverly in conversations. She had grown up without money in a small town that most people in those rooms had never heard of. She had no title, no inherited connection, no family name that meant anything to anyone in those circles. She had only herself, her mind, her work, her presence, and then she had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that herself was enough. But learning that something is enough and feeling it to be true in every room you walk into are two different things. She did not want to go to this ball and feel small. That was the fear, if she named it plainly. Not that anything terrible would happen. Just that familiar feeling of not quite fitting the shape of the space, of being looked at and found less than expected, of having to work twice as hard to be taken seriously by people who had decided in the first 20 seconds what category she belonged to. She got home and stood in her bedroom looking at the navy dress hanging on the wardrobe door. It was a good dress, simple and well made, with clean lines and a quality to it that she had noticed immediately when she found it in a small shop 3 years ago, and spent slightly too much on it, and had never regretted it. She looked at the dress and she had a very clear thought. This dress is good enough. I am good enough. I am going, and whatever happens there, I will handle it. She called her mother on Thursday evening. Elaine answered on the third ring, as she always did. She did not like to seem eager, and she did not like to seem unavailable. This was very typical of her. "How was the birthday?" Elaine asked. "It was good. Clara came in the morning. We talked all day." "And you're eating properly? You always forget to eat properly when you're busy." "I'm eating properly, Mom. I'm sending you something in the post. Don't ask what it is, just know it will arrive by Friday." This was also very typical of her. Elaine communicated love primarily through packages sent in the post, items that were practical, carefully chosen, and accompanied by a note in her small, precise handwriting that always said something simple and true. "There's a ball on Saturday," Marguerite said. "A charity event. Clara's taking me." A pause. "What kind of ball?" "The formal kind. Harwick House. Lots of people I don't know." Another pause. "Wear the navy dress," Elaine said. "It makes you look like yourself." Marguerite smiled at the phone. "I was already planning to." "Good. Don't let anyone talk you into anything smaller than you are. You know how those rooms can be." She did know. Elaine had never been to Harwick House. She had spent her whole life in Weston. But she knew about rooms, the ones that made you feel the right size, and the ones that tried to make you feel smaller. She had a reliable instinct for the difference, and she had passed some portion of it to her daughter. "I won't," Marguerite said. "Call me Sunday morning." "I will." Love. Love. The package arrived Friday morning, as promised. It was a small box, and inside it was a pair of earrings, simple pearl drops, the kind that are elegant without announcing themselves, and a note in Elaine's handwriting that said, "These were your grandmother's. I think you should have them now. They suit women who know their own minds." Marguerite sat at her kitchen table and held the earrings in her palm for a long time. They were small and quiet and beautiful. Her grandmother had been a woman she had known only briefly. She had died when Marguerite was 11, but she remembered her with a particular vividness. A small, straight-backed woman with silver hair and a way of looking at you that made you feel you had been seen clearly and found acceptable exactly as you were. She put the earrings in her ears and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The pearl drops caught the morning light. She thought, all right then. Saturday. The day of the ball was cold and clear. The kind of evening that arrives in autumn when the air has not yet hardened into winter but has taken on a definite crispness that makes everything feel sharper, more precisely itself. Marguerite spent most of the day working, which was always the best way to keep her mind from making too much of something before it arrived. She filed a piece she had been finishing all week, answered her outstanding messages, and went for a walk in the early afternoon that took her down to the river and back. At 6 o'clock she began to get ready. She was not someone who took a long time with these things. She dressed with the efficiency of someone who has always had a clear sense of what suits them and why. The navy dress, the pearl earrings from her grandmother, a thin trace of something dark around her eyes, a shade of lipstick she had worn long enough that it felt like her own, Clara's emerald green wrap, which had arrived by courier that morning with a note that said, "You were right, it does suit you. I knew it would." Edward arrived at 7:45 in a car that was considerably nicer than anything Marguerite usually rode in. He was exactly as Clara had described him. Tall, cheerful, with the effortless ease of someone who has spent so much time at events like this one that they have entirely stopped thinking of them as occasions. He told them both they looked wonderful in a way that managed to be complimentary without being excessive, and drove them through the city while Clara talked and Marguerite looked out the window at the streets going past. Harwick House announced itself from a distance. It was one of those buildings that the city had built around, the way rivers build around a large stone. The streets adjusted their angles to accommodate it rather than the other way around. It was lit up from the outside, warm gold light falling from tall windows, and there were cars arriving, people stepping out onto the wide front steps in evening clothes, the murmur and movement of a gathering already in progress. Marguerite stepped out of the car and felt the cold air and the faint noise of the city, and looked up at the lit windows of Harwick House and felt, quietly and clearly, that she was ready. "All right?" Clara said beside her. "Yes," Marguerite said, and she meant it. They went up the steps together, into the warmth and the light and the low roar of the party inside, and Marguerite crossed the threshold of Harwick House with her head up and her grandmother's pearl earrings catching the light and the emerald wrap around her shoulders, and she walked in the way she had learned to walk into difficult rooms, not as though she owned them, but as though she had every right to be there, which she did, and which she knew. The room beyond the entrance was vast and high-ceilinged, hung with old portraits and lit by chandeliers that cast a warm, slightly golden light over everything. Tables were set for dinner at one end. At the other, people stood in groups with their glasses, talking, the conversations overlapping into a sound that was pleasant and indistinct from a distance. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays. A string quartet played something slow and lilting in a corner. Marguerite took a glass from a passing tray and stood for a moment, simply taking it all in. She was looking for Noel Whitfield. She was also looking, in the way you do when you enter a new room, for the quality of the space, what kind of room this was going to turn out to be, which people in it were going to be worth knowing, where the evening's real conversations were likely to happen. She did not look for Lord Ashfield. She had no reason to. He was simply one name among others that Clara had mentioned on her birthday morning, and she had filed it away without much thought. She did not know, standing there in the warm golden light with her glass and her grandmother's earrings and the emerald green wrap, that he was already in the room, that he had already, in the way of people like him, begun to move through it with the ease of someone who has never had to wonder whether he belonged anywhere, because it had never in his life occurred to him that he might not. She did not know this yet. She was simply standing in the light, looking at the room, deciding how to begin. And somewhere across the polished floor, the evening was already in motion. Edward, who knew how these evenings worked in a way that came from long practice, had already moved toward a group near the far end of the room and was shaking hands with a man in a dark suit. Clara touched Marguerite's arm and said, "I see someone I need to speak with from the Arts Board. Will you be all right for a few minutes?" "I have always been all right for a few minutes," Marguerite said. Clara smiled and went, and Marguerite stood briefly alone in the way she had long since learned to stand alone in rooms, not in the manner of someone waiting to be rescued, but in the manner of someone taking a moment to choose her own direction. She scanned the room with the practiced attention she brought to most things. There was the Baroness, who was exactly as Marguerite had imagined from Clara's description, a woman of considerable age and upright posture, speaking to a group of three with the composed authority of someone who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval. There was the painter whose recent exhibition had caused argument, younger than Marguerite had expected, standing slightly apart with the expression of someone who found social events tolerable but not especially interesting. And there, near the central fireplace, which was vast and lit and giving off genuine heat, was a cluster of people that had the particular quality of a group assembled around a center of gravity. There was a man in the middle of it. Not tall, but present in the way that certain people are present, as though they have been given slightly more definition than the people around them. He had silver at the edges of his dark hair, and the easy, uncomplicated confidence of someone who has never had to earn his place in a room. He was laughing at something someone had said, and the laugh was comfortable and full, the laugh of a man who expects his laughter to be welcomed. And he was right to expect it, because the people around him were all smiling in the particular way people smile when the person at the center of the group is amused. Marguerite looked at this scene for a moment, and then looked away. She had seen rooms organized this way before. She had no particular interest in the center of gravity, or in attaching herself to it. She was here for the children's charity, and for Noel Whitfield, and possibly for the string quartet, who were playing something she now recognized, a Schubert piece she had always loved, and for whatever else the evening chose to offer. She moved toward the side of the room where the string quartet played, because she wanted a moment to listen properly, and because experience had taught her that the most interesting conversations at events like this one often happened on the margins rather than at the center, where the performance of being at a center was too consuming to allow for anything genuine. She was right, as it turned out. Within 10 minutes, standing near the musicians, she found herself in conversation with the elderly Baroness, who had escaped the group she had been speaking with, and who turned to Marguerite with the directness of someone who has no time left to waste on false pleasantries. And they began talking about the charity's work, and then about a piece of research the Baroness had read recently on early childhood development, and then about a book that Marguerite had actually reviewed the previous year, which the Baroness had also read, and their views on it were so different and so interestingly expressed that the conversation became something alive and quick and genuinely absorbing. The Baroness's name was Lady Constance Albright. She was 71 years old and had spent 30 years working in child welfare policy. She had a clear, quick mind and the wonderful social quality of someone who is entirely unimpressed by status in any direction. She was as disinterested in her own title as she was in anyone else's, and this made her remarkably easy to talk to. She also had a dry sense of humor that she deployed sparingly and to great effect. They had been talking for perhaps 20 minutes when Constance said, looking past Marguerite's shoulder, "Ah, Ashfield has arrived at this end of the room." Marguerite turned slightly. The man from the fireplace, Lord Ashfield, was moving through the room in the way that men with his particular combination of title and ease always move, unhurried, looking neither left nor right with any urgency, assuming that whoever was worth speaking with would still be there when he arrived. He was accompanied by 2 other men and a woman, and they were heading in the direction of the drinks table that was positioned not far from where Marguerite and Constance were standing. "Do you know him well?" Marguerite asked. "Long enough," Constance said with the tone of someone who had arrived at a settled opinion on a subject and saw no reason to revise it. "He means well, I think, in the way that men of his particular background often mean well. He simply does not always see very clearly." Marguerite nodded. This was a description she had heard applied to various people over the years, and it was always, in her experience, both accurate and insufficient as a full account of the problem. Meaning well while not seeing clearly tended to produce its own particular kind of damage, which was sometimes harder to address than straightforward poor intentions, because the person doing the damage genuinely could not understand why they were being asked to account for it. She was about to say something in response when the group arrived at the drinks table, and Edward, who had apparently circled the room while Marguerite was talking to Constance, appeared from somewhere and exchanged brief greetings with Lord Ashfield, and then turned and said, with the cheerful ease that was his default register, "Lord Ashfield, let me introduce. This is Clara from the paper, who is here with me tonight, and this is—" He turned to include Marguerite in the introduction. Lord Ashfield looked at Clara first, because Clara was standing slightly closer, and he shook her hand with a practiced ease and said something brief and cordial. Then his eyes moved to Marguerite, and there was a fraction of a second, she would notice it later, turning the evening over in her mind, in which she could see him processing her, the navy dress, the wrap, the pearl earrings, the face he did not recognize, all of it assembled quickly into a category. And the category he arrived at was, evidently, not one that he found especially significant. He did not look at her the way he had looked at Clara. He did not quite look at her at all, really. He looked past her slightly, as though her position in the room were temporary and slightly inconvenient for the normal geography of the conversation. And then he smiled in the direction of Edward and said, with the ease of someone who has been performing this particular kind of ease for so many decades that it no longer required any conscious effort, "And this must be the other one." He said it lightly. Not with malice, she was sure of that, even in the moment. It was simply how he spoke when he encountered someone he had already categorized as peripheral. He was not even being rude by his own standards. He was being efficient, moving through the introduction with the minimum required investment. He had decided, in that fraction of a second, that she was not someone he needed to pay attention to, and the phrase he chose to mark that decision was the one that came naturally, the other one. Marguerite looked at him for a moment. The room continued around them, the string quartet, the clinking of glasses, the low tide of conversation, the golden light from the chandeliers. Constance was standing half a step behind her, and was entirely still in the way of someone exercising very deliberate restraint. And then Marguerite smiled. It was a particular kind of smile. Not a smile of warmth or welcome, not the brittle smile of someone concealing hurt, which would have bent slightly at the corners with the effort of keeping it in place. It was a calm, clear smile, the kind that comes from a place so far below the surface that it is not affected by what happens on top. It was the smile of someone who has just received a piece of information that was in some ways surprising and in other ways absolutely not surprising at all, and who has filed it away in the correct location for future reference. She held his gaze for one steady moment. Then she said, pleasantly and without any particular emphasis, "How fascinating." And then she turned back to Constance, because Constance was the more interesting of her options, and she had something she had wanted to say in response to what they had been discussing before the interruption, and she said it. Lord Ashfield moved away. Edward looked mildly uncomfortable. Clara, who had arrived in time to see the exchange, looked at Marguerite with an expression that was half fury on her behalf, and half something closer to amazement. Marguerite caught her eye briefly and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Not now, not here, later. Constance said nothing about it at all. She simply picked up the thread of their conversation in the precise place it had been dropped, with the particular grace of someone who understood that the best thing she could do in that moment was to treat Marguerite as exactly what she was, a person worth talking to. And so they talked. And the evening continued, as evenings do, whether or not someone in it has just attempted to make you smaller than you are. Marguerite let it continue. She had things to do here, and people to meet, and a sculptor she had not yet found, and a string quartet playing Schubert, and a glass in her hand, and her grandmother's earrings, and 34 years of being exactly herself, in rooms that did not always know what to do with her. She was not going to let one careless sentence from one careless man change any of that. Not tonight, at least. What she would decide about it later, in the morning, in the quiet of her flat, over a cup of tea, was a different matter. But she had learned, among many other things, that the time for deciding is rarely in the middle of the room where the thing happened. You let the thing happen. You file it. You finish the evening on your own terms. And then you decide. She had always been good at deciding. She found Noel Whitfield standing alone near one of the tall windows, looking out at the city below with the distracted air of someone whose mind is elsewhere even when their body is present. He was shorter than she had imagined. She always imagined artists as taller than they turned out to be, for some reason she could not account for. And he had large, rough hands that looked as though they belonged to someone who worked with them, which of course he did. He was drinking water, not wine, and he held the glass loosely, as though he had forgotten it was there. She walked toward him with the kind of directness that she had spent years learning to trust. In her earlier 20s, she had been prone to the hesitation that many people feel before introducing themselves to someone they admire, the fear of seeming presumptuous, or of the person turning out to be disappointing, or of simply not knowing what to say. She had worked through most of that. She still felt a faint threat of it as she approached him now, but she walked through it the way you walk through a light rain. You acknowledge it. You do not let it stop you. "You're Noel Whitfield," she said, not a question. He turned from the window. He had a plain, serious face with light brown eyes that were slightly magnified behind a pair of wire-framed glasses. He looked at her with the unhurried attention of someone who actually looked at people rather than past them. "I am," he said. "And you are?" "Marguerite Slade. I write for the Margin. I reviewed your Feltham installation last spring and got it completely wrong, and I've been hoping for a chance to tell you that in person." He tilted his head slightly. "You reviewed the Feltham piece?" "I did. I wrote that it was about absence, that the empty spaces in the iron structure were the subject of the work. I still think that's partly true, but I've thought about it since and I think I missed the more important thing, which is that it's about weight, the weight of what the spaces are holding." Noel Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he had been looking at the city outside the window, with a focused, unhurried attention. Then he said, "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about that piece." It was not a compliment designed to be charming. It had the quality of a statement of fact, delivered by someone who was simply reporting what was true. This, she sensed immediately, was the mode in which he operated. Plain speech, without ornament, without the social inflation that most people applied to their words at events like this one. They talked for a long time. They moved away from the window, The room was filling up further, the noise level rising, the dinner tables beginning to draw people, and found a quieter spot near a side corridor where they could hear each other properly. They talked about the Feltham piece and about the new work he was planning, and about the particular problem of making something large that did not simply impose itself on people, but invited them to bring something to it. They talked about her essay on his earlier work, which he had read. She had not expected this, and which he had found interesting and wrong in different ways than the review, which led to another thread of conversation. She was aware, during all of this, of the rest of the room going on around them. She was aware of Clara circulating nearby with the social ease that was one of her genuine gifts. She was aware of Constance Albright holding court across the room with the serene authority of someone who has earned, over 71 years, the right to say precisely what she thinks. She was aware, at the edge of her awareness, like a noise you can hear without specifically listening for it, of Lord Ashfield, who had moved to the dinner tables and was positioned, she noted without any particular heat, at the head of the central table. She did not go toward him. She had no reason to. She turned her attention back to Noel Whitfield and let the conversation continue. And it was the kind of conversation she had gone to events like this one hoping to have and so rarely actually found. At a certain point, the general movement toward the dinner tables became too clear to ignore. Noel said something practical about finding their seats and they walked together toward the dining end of the room. He found her name on the seating plan and noted that they were not at the same table, which they both seemed to find simultaneously reasonable and slightly disappointing. "I'd like to read what you write next," he said, before they separated. "I don't say that to most people." "Thank you," she said. "I'd like to see the new work when it's ready." "It's not ready yet. It might be terrible." "I'm prepared for that possibility." He almost smiled. "Good evening, Marguerite Slade." "Good evening, Noel Whitfield." She found her table. It was a round table with 8 seats, already half occupied. She was placed between a city councillor whose name she recognized from the papers and a woman she did not know who introduced herself as Frances Webb, a fundraising consultant who worked with several medical charities including this one. Frances was warm and funny and immediately interested in Marguerite's work in a way that was genuine rather than polite, and they fell into conversation easily. Across the table was a man she had not yet met, introduced as Henry Brace, who worked in documentary film, and he and Marguerite exchanged a few words across the flowers and candles that occupied the middle of the table, and she felt the early sense that he might be interesting to know, which was different from the social performance of being interesting, which was quite different again from actually being interested in the person sitting across from you, and she appreciated the distinction. The dinner was, as Clara had promised, very good. Several courses, well-spaced, allowing for conversation rather than demanding it pause for the arrival of food. Wine was poured and poured again. The room took on the particular atmosphere of a dinner that is going well, the warmth and noise and ease of people who are fed and comfortable and in good company. She was happy, that was the simple truth of it. She had found interesting people to speak with, she had eaten well, she was wearing a dress she liked, and she had had the conversation with Noel Whitfield that had made the whole evening worthwhile regardless of anything else. She was happy in the uncomplicated way that you are happy when something you were uncertain about has turned out better than you feared. And then, during a pause between courses, when the table was briefly caught in one of those social silences that sometimes descend at dinner parties, small and not unpleasant, the city councillor beside her leaned slightly in her direction and said, in a lowered voice with the tone of someone relaying a secret that was already widely known, "Do you know what Ashfield said earlier? Someone pointed him toward you before dinner and told him who you were. I was standing close enough to hear," he said. "Ah, the writer. I thought she was the other one." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. The city councillor continued, apparently not reading her silence correctly. He meant it as a compliment, I think. Or as a correction of his earlier impression. He seemed pleased to have more information. Marguerite looked at this man, who was probably 50, with a well-meaning face, who had just delivered this information in the spirit of letting her know that the situation had been improved, and she felt something settle in her chest with a particular weight. Not anger exactly, something cooler and more precise than anger. A kind of final, clear confirmation of something she had suspected within 30 seconds of the original introduction. He had not said the other one because he was having a bad evening, or because he was a uniquely cruel person, or because he had been careless in that particular moment. He had said it because that was the category he kept available for women he had not yet been told to regard as significant, and when he was told, when some intermediary furnished him with context, a name, a profession, a reason to adjust his assessment, his response was not to reconsider the framework, it was simply to reclassify, from one without context to one with, from not worth looking at to worth knowing about, from the other one to the writer. He did not see the problem. He would not have seen the problem if she had explained it to him. She was relatively certain of this. She looked at the city councilor beside her. She smiled, in the same way she had smiled before, clearly, steadily, from a place below the surface. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and then she turned toward Francis Webb and continued the conversation they had been having about the funding model for early medical intervention programs, which was considerably more interesting. Francis, who had been watching from the other side of the exchange, caught her eye briefly. She said nothing, but there was something in her expression, not pity, but recognition, that told Marguerite she had understood exactly what had just happened and had chosen the right response. The courses continued. The wine was poured again. The string quartet, who had moved into the dinner area and were playing from a raised corner, shifted to something brighter and more festive. Around her, the table was full of noise and warmth, and the overlapping sounds of people enjoying themselves. She enjoyed herself too. This was the part that would matter, later, when she looked back on the evening. Not that something unkind had happened, but that she had refused to let it occupy any more of the evening than the few seconds it had taken to occur. She had looked at it clearly, filed it precisely, and returned to the people and the food and the conversation that were actually in front of her. Henry Brace across the table told a story about filming in a remote valley for 6 weeks that became funnier and more improbable as it continued. Francis Webb described the moment she had decided to leave a very well-paid job to do work she cared about, and how it had been the most frightening and most correct decision of her life. The city councilor, making a partial amends for his earlier relay of information, turned out to have a detailed and passionate knowledge of Victorian park design that surprised everyone at the table and was genuinely fascinating for several minutes. Later in the evening, after dinner, when the tables had been pushed back and people were moving freely again, she found herself standing with Clara in the quieter section of the room near the string quartet, both of them with their shoes off, a mutual decision made without discussion, and Clara said, quietly and carefully, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Marguerite said. "Edward told me what Ashfield said during the introduction. I should have. I'm sorry I wasn't standing closer. There's nothing you could have done, and I handled it. I know you did. I watched you." A pause. The string quartet was playing something slow now, something with a long, patient melody that unfolded in no particular hurry. "He said it again," Marguerite said, "when someone told him who I was. Apparently he improved the category to writer. Progress." Clara was quiet. She had a particular quality of quiet that meant she was thinking something she was going to say very precisely, or not at all. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" Marguerite thought about her flat. She thought about her cold morning tea and the notebook on her desk and the line she had written. "I think I am ready for whatever comes next, and I do not need it to be gentle." She thought about her grandmother's pearl earrings. She thought about Noel Whitfield saying, in his plain, factual way, "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about that piece." She thought about Constance Albright continuing their conversation after the interruption, as though it had simply not happened, because it was not worth allowing it to interrupt anything. She picked up her shoes from the floor beside her. "I'm going to finish my evening," she said, "and then I'm going to go home and think." And then? She looked at the room, the warm light, the moving people, the music, with the clear, precise attention she brought to things she was looking at for the last time. "And then," she said, "I'll decide." She did not know yet what she would decide. She had an instinct about it, the way you have an instinct about things before the full thought has fully formed. But the thing about instincts, she had learned, was that they were usually worth trusting. They were the accumulated intelligence of every experience you had had telling you something it had learned. She was 34 years old and she had had a considerable number of experiences. Her instincts at this point were quite reliable. They put their shoes back on and went to say their goodbyes. Marguerite found Constance Albright near the exit, in conversation with a woman she did not know. Constance saw her coming, and excused herself from the other conversation, with an ease that suggested she had been looking for a reason to end it. "You're leaving?" Constance asked. "I think so. It's been a good evening." Constance looked at her with the direct, unhurried assessment that Marguerite had noticed from the beginning of their conversation, and that she had come to understand was not evaluative in the usual social sense, not a looking over to determine worth or rank, but simply seeing. The Baroness looked at people to see them, as opposed to looking at them to determine how they fitted into whatever order she carried in her mind. "You handled that well," Constance said. Marguerite did not pretend not to know what she meant. "Thank you. He will not remember it," Constance said. "Tomorrow morning he will have moved on entirely. That's the particular quality of people who do not pay attention. They also do not retain. You should know that." "I know it." "Good. Because whatever you decide to do with it, and I suspect you will do something, it should be for your own sake, not in the hope of making an impression on a man whose impressions are formed in the first 20 seconds and rarely revised. Marguerite looked at her. That is very direct advice from someone I met 2 hours ago. I am 71, Constance said. I don't have time for the slow version. Marguerite smiled. A real smile this time, warm and genuine. Would you like to meet for lunch sometime? I think I'd like to continue our conversation. I would like that very much, Constance said. Have Clara get my number from Edward, not Ashfield's crowd. I have my own calendar. She said this without particular feeling, the way you state a simple fact about the layout of the road. This way leads there, that way leads somewhere else. It was not a sharp comment. It was simply accurate. They exchanged the small formalities of leave-taking. Marguerite found Edward near the entrance, thanked him with genuine warmth, and went with Clara out into the cold night air that hit them both after the warmth of the room like stepping into clean water. The street outside Harwick House was quieter now than it had been when they arrived. A few other cars, the distant sound of the city, the stars that were visible in patches between the clouds. Marguerite stood on the wide front steps and breathed the cold air and felt the evening settle around her like a coat. Edward's getting the car, Clara said. Good. Are you going to tell me what you're thinking? Marguerite looked at the city lights beyond the rooftops. I'm thinking about Constance Albright and her directness. I'm thinking about Noel Whitfield's hands and the way he looks at things. I'm thinking about Francis Webb and Henry Brace, and the good story about the valley that turned out to be real. She paused. I am thinking about a man who said the other one twice in one evening, and would not, I suspect, understand why that mattered, even if you explained it to him in very simple terms. And what does that add up to? Something I already knew, but have now confirmed. The car appeared at the end of the street. Edward raised a hand in greeting from behind the wheel. Clara said gently, which is? Marguerite picked up the emerald wrap slightly, adjusting it around her shoulders against the cold. The pearl earrings were still in her ears. The navy dress was still exactly the right dress. That there are rooms that know what you are and rooms that do not, she said. And you can spend enormous energy trying to make the second kind see you properly, or you can spend your energy making sure you're always standing in rooms that can. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds like a decision. Not quite yet, Marguerite said. Tomorrow, over tea. They got into the car. Edward drove them through the city, and Clara talked for most of the journey, because that was what Clara did, and Marguerite looked out the window at the streets going past, the wet pavement catching the orange of the streetlights, the occasional person walking alone, the late-night windows of buildings still lit up, lives continuing inside them in ways she could not know, and she turned the evening over in her mind with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. She had gone to Harwick House uncertain and had left it certain of several things, certain that Constance Albright was someone she would know well, and that the knowing would be worth a great deal, certain that Noel Whitfield's work was even more extraordinary than she had thought, and that she owed it a better piece than anything she had written about it so far, certain that Francis Webb and Henry Brace were people worth knowing, certain that the Children's Charity had good people working for it, and that the evening had raised money for something real. And certain, with the clean, quiet certainty of something that has been building for a long time and has finally been spoken clearly, that she was done with rooms that would call her the other one without thinking twice about it, and that done was the right word, and that the decision, when she made it properly, would not require any anger or drama. It would simply require her to stop going where she was not seen, and to go, with all the energy she had, toward the places where she was. She did not know, sitting in the back of Edward's car watching the city go past, that this clarity was going to shape the next several years of her life in ways both small and significant. She did not know how many rooms she was going to walk away from, or what she was going to build in the space that walking away created. She did not know about the friendship with Constance that would become one of the most important of her life, or about the collaboration with Noel that was going to begin with a phone call 3 weeks from now, or about the work she was going to do, slowly, carefully, and with growing confidence, that was going to put her name in rooms where it had not been before. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew what she had confirmed tonight, that she was solid, and real, and worth knowing, and that she had been kind enough to herself over 34 years to prove it to herself completely, even if some people in some rooms had not yet been paying attention. Edward dropped Clara off first, and then drove Marguerite to her street. She thanked him, and got out into the cold air, and walked to her building, and let herself in, and went up the stairs. She stood in her flat for a moment, in the dark, without turning on the lights. The street lamp outside cast a pale stripe across the kitchen floor. Her notebook was on the desk where she had left it. Her plants were on the windowsill. The flat was exactly as she had left it. Her life, sitting quietly where she had put it, waiting for her to come home. She went to the desk and opened the notebook. She read, by the light from outside, what she had written on her birthday morning. I think I am ready for whatever comes next, and I do not need it to be gentle. Then she picked up her pen and wrote below it, in her careful, precise handwriting. I was right. She closed the notebook. She took off her grandmother's earrings and put them carefully on the small dish on her bedside table. She took off the navy dress and hung it back on its hanger. She washed her face, which was one of those quietly satisfying rituals that always seemed to mark the clean end of one thing and the beginning of another. She got into bed. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. A distant car, the wind in the trees, the particular silence that is not quite silence, that lives underneath everything in a city at night. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, the other one. And then she let out a slow, steady breath. And she slept. Sunday morning arrived the way autumn Sunday mornings do. Gently, without urgency, with thin light coming through the curtains at an angle that suggested the day was making no particular demands. Marguerite woke earlier than usual, which was the pattern after evenings that had contained something significant. Her mind had been working while she slept, sorting through the events of the previous night with the industrious efficiency of a well-organized filing system. She lay in bed for a few minutes, not moving, listening to the quiet of the flat and the ordinary sounds of the street below. Someone was walking a dog. There was the brief, repeated sound of a recycling truck making its slow progress down the road. A bird was doing something emphatic in the tree outside the window. Ordinary sounds, Sunday sounds, the sounds of a world that had no idea what had happened the night before and no particular interest in finding out. She got up. She made tea, proper tea, in a pot, the way her mother had always made it, the one indulgence that she had inherited from Elaine without question or revision. She carried the pot and a mug to the kitchen table and sat down and looked at the empty table and thought. Not frantically, not with the spinning quality of thoughts that are trying to escape their own conclusions, simply and plainly, the way she thought about most things, with patience, and without any prior commitment to arriving at a particular destination. She thought about what had happened at the ball. She turned it over slowly and looked at it from several angles the way you turn over an object in your hands to see what it is made of. Lord Ashfield had called her the other one. This was a fact. He had done it without malice. She was still sure of this, in the cold light of morning, and she thought it was important to remain sure of it, because attributing malice where there was none was its own kind of error. He had not been trying to hurt her. He had simply not been thinking about her as a person at all. She had been, in that moment, a fixture in the geography of the room. Not someone, but something. An element requiring minimal acknowledgement before his attention moved on to what he considered the actual content of the space. This was a distinction she had been making for years, quietly, and without advertising it to anyone. The difference between people who chose not to see you and people who simply didn't notice to look. The second category was in some ways worse, because it was not a choice you could argue against or address. It was simply a blindness, a room in their vision where you should have been. And then he had been told who she was, and his response had been to reclassify, not to reconsider. The category system stayed exactly as it was. He simply had more information now with which to sort her into a better one. The writer. As though that were the thing that made her worth looking at. As though the 34 years of being a person, of building a life under her own power, of loving her friends and caring for her work and sleeping through grief and getting up again after it. As though all of that were invisible, until a profession was attached to it that he recognized as worth something. She poured a second mug of tea. Outside, the recycling truck had moved on. The bird in the tree had stopped its emphatic commentary and gone wherever birds go next. The question she was turning over was not whether Lord Ashfield was a good person. She genuinely did not know the answer to that, and it was not, she had concluded, particularly relevant to her. People could be good people and still operate frameworks that were damaging. People could mean well and still look at a woman they had never met and decide, in 20 seconds, that she was the other one. These things were not mutually exclusive, and the failure to understand that was one of the great convenient misunderstandings that certain kinds of people maintained about themselves. The question she was actually turning over was this: what do I want to do with this information? She had several options. She could do nothing, file the evening away as an interesting experience and continue her life as it was. This was a legitimate choice. She was not obligated to act on every piece of information she received. Not everything that happened to you required a response. She could be angry. She had a right to be angry. She was not particularly angry, she noticed, sitting with her tea. But the absence of anger was not the same thing as the absence of a clear view of what had happened. She had simply arrived over the years at a place where clear seeing and hot feeling had been separated to some degree. She could see something clearly without it igniting her. This was a skill, not a suppression. She could speak, write about it, the way she wrote about other things she needed to understand. She considered this, turned it around. It had a potential use. Words had always been the way she processed experience, had always given her a better grip on things that were otherwise slippery. Writing it might clarify what she knew, might let her say it in terms precise enough to be useful to someone else. Or she could simply stop going to those rooms. Stop spending her energy on spaces that would look at her and not see her and then need to be corrected in their view by an external source of information. She could take all the energy that went into those evenings, the preparation, the performance, the particular wariness that rooms like that one required, and she could put it somewhere else. Into the people who had already shown her what they were, into the work, into the rooms where they knew who she was before she arrived. This option had a quality she recognized. It was not dramatic. It did not involve confrontation or declaration. It was simply a direction, a turning away from one thing and toward another. She called her mother at 9:30. As she had promised. Elaine answered on the third ring. How was the ball? Marguerite told her. Not all of it. She did not give her mother every detail, partly because some of it would worry Elaine and partly because she had not yet finished thinking it through herself, and she did not want to arrive at the end of a conversation with someone else before she had arrived at the end of it in her own mind. But she told her enough. She told her about Constance Albright and Noel Whitfield. She told her about Francis Webb and the documentary filmmaker. She told her about Lord Ashfield and what he had said. There was a silence on the other end of the line. And then? Elaine asked. And then I smiled and said how fascinating, and turned back to Constance. Another short silence. Marguerite imagined her mother at her kitchen table in Weston. The table that had been in that kitchen for as long as she could remember, slightly uneven on one leg so that you had to be careful with full mugs, drinking her own tea and thinking. Good, Elaine said. That's exactly right. I think I'm going to stop going to those kinds of events. Then stop. Just like that? Just like that, Elaine said. There's no rule that says you have to go to places that don't deserve you. You're not obligated to educate everyone. Some people will never learn what you're teaching them anyway. Spend your time on better things. This was Elaine's style of wisdom. Plain-spoken, practical, with no excess. No performance of insight, no wrapping of it in softer language to make the delivery more appealing. Just the thing itself. Marguerite had spent portions of her life wishing her mother were more demonstrative, and had come, in her 30s, to appreciate the particular integrity of someone who communicated exactly what they thought without adornment. The earrings are beautiful, Marguerite said. Thank you. They suited your grandmother, Elaine said. She had your way of walking into rooms. What way is that? A pause. Certain, Elaine said. She always looked certain, even when she wasn't. It's the looking that matters, most of the time. The certainty comes later. Marguerite thought about this. Was she actually certain, do you think, on the inside? Almost never, Elaine said, but she walked like she was, and so people treated her accordingly, and over time the two came together. I think you've done the same. She called Clara after she hung up with Elaine. Clara answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting. How are you? Clara asked. I'm good. I've been thinking. I thought you might be. Tell me. She told her what she had been working through at the kitchen table over her 2 mugs of tea. Clara listened without interrupting, which was not her natural habit, but which she did when she understood the person on the other end needed to be heard, rather than engaged. When Marguerite finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. So you're not going back, Clara said. I'm not going back to rooms like that one, to rooms where I have to fight for the basic fact of my existence before the conversation can start. I'm not angry about it. I just don't want to spend my energy there anymore. What about Constance and Noel Whitfield? Constance is not a room. She's a person. I'm going to have lunch with her. Noel is not a room either. She paused. The room was the problem. The people in it, who were worth knowing regardless of the room. That's a useful distinction, Clara said. I've been making it all morning. A pause. Then Clara said, with the gentleness she reserved for the things she said that she meant completely. I'm proud of you, you know. Not for the way you handled Ashfield, although that was extraordinary and I'm still thinking about it, but for this, for not letting it make you smaller, for knowing the difference between the room and the person. Marguerite held the phone for a moment. He's not going to understand it, she said. Ashfield. If someone told him I'd decided not to attend events like that one anymore, He would probably think I was making a statement aimed at him. He probably would. And it's not. It's aimed entirely at myself. At what I want my life to look like. I know, Clara said. That's what makes it the right decision. They talked for a while longer. About other things. About plans for the week ahead. About the piece Clara was working on. And the essay Marguerite had been circling. Eventually they said goodbye. Marguerite sat for a while longer at the kitchen table. The light had changed as the morning progressed, moving from the pale, early-hour quality to something clearer and more direct. The flat was very quiet. Her notebook sat on the desk. Her plants were on the windowsill, one of them leaning slightly toward the window in the way plants do when they have decided where the light is and have committed to going there. She went to the desk and opened the notebook. She looked at the 2 lines she had written, the one from Saturday morning and the one from the night before. She read them again. Then she wrote a third. She wrote, "I know what I'm building now, and I know what I'm walking away from. Both feel right." She closed the notebook. She went to put on her shoes and her coat. It was a Sunday morning and the autumn light was clear, and she was going to walk through the city, not toward anything in particular, just through it, the way she did when she needed to think, and found that her thoughts organized themselves more cleanly when her body was moving. She walked for 2 hours, through the park where the trees were doing their seasonal color, the reds and the russets and the particular dark gold of the oaks, and down along the river path and through the market that ran along the embankment on Sundays, full of people and noise and the smell of coffee and fresh bread. She stopped and bought a small bunch of flowers from a stall run by a woman who had the same gray eyes as her grandmother. She walked home with the flowers and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill next to the plant that was leaning toward the light. She looked at the flowers and the plant and the light coming through the window and thought, "This is what I want more of." The flowers, the light, the plant reaching without apology toward the source of what it needs. She had some work to do. She sat down and opened her laptop. She began. The essay she opened that Sunday afternoon was one she had been circling for 3 months. She had notes toward it going back further than that, fragments she had written in the margins of notebooks, paragraphs she had started and abandoned, observations that she had felt were trying to tell her something and that she had not yet been ready to hear. The essay was about what it felt like to be seen partially, not unseen entirely, which had its own quality, its own distinct shape of hurt, but partially, seen just enough to be processed, just enough for a working category to be assigned, and then released. The way certain people looked at you and looked away with the satisfied air of someone who has just adequately filed something. The way that particular look communicated, without saying so, that you had been understood well enough and there was no need to look further. She had not known, until the previous evening, how to begin this essay in a way that felt true. She had had the feeling, the precise, specific feeling of being filed rather than seen, but she had not had an event sharp enough and clear enough to give it a form that would carry meaning for someone else. Now she had one. She did not use names. She was careful about that. She was not interested in making the essay about any individual, because individuals were not the point. The point was the structure, the framework, the set of assumptions that allowed a man to look at a woman at a party and say the other one without blinking, without awareness, without any sense that he had said something worth accounting for. That framework was the subject. He was just the evening in which she had encountered it most clearly. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping in the serious way, only pausing to make more tea. She wrote the way she wrote when something was working, with a speed that felt like clarity rather than hurry, the words finding their shape without too much resistance, the argument organizing itself as though it had been waiting to be put in order, and was relieved to finally have the chance. She wrote about what it felt like to walk into a room knowing that some people in it had already decided your category. She wrote about the energy it cost to exist in that kind of attention, the particular, constant low-level adjustment that was required to present yourself in a way that created enough friction to override the first impression. She wrote about what it meant that this adjustment was expected, was built into the social contract of those spaces, and that refusing to perform it was somehow more notable than the fact that it was required. She wrote about women she had known over the years who had spent enormous portions of their intelligence and energy managing this dynamic, and what the alternative might look like for a woman who decided, at a certain point, to stop. She wrote about her grandmother, not at length, just briefly, with the precision that brevity requires. She wrote about the earrings, and what Elaine had said about the way the old woman walked, certain, even when she wasn't, and about the transmission of that particular quality, across generations of women, who had had to learn to take up space in rooms that were not sure they belonged. She wrote about the smile, not explaining it in clinical terms but describing it from the inside, what it had felt like to produce that smile, what it had come from, where it was stored in the body. She wrote about the difference between the smile of someone swallowing hurt and the smile of someone who has registered something and filed it and is moving on. She wrote that these two smiles can look similar from the outside but are entirely different in their internal weight. She wrote about what she was going to do next. Or rather, because the essay was not a personal manifesto but a shared experience, not her specific decision, but a kind of thought experiment available to anyone who recognized themselves in it. She wrote about what it might look like to stop asking rooms to see you properly, and start choosing rooms that already could. By the time she stopped, the light outside had changed from the clear brightness of the afternoon to the softer blue of early evening. She sat back from her laptop and looked at what she had written. It was long, longer than her usual pieces, longer than most of what she published. It was also, she thought, the most honest thing she had written in several years. Not honest in the confessional sense, but honest in the structural sense. A piece of thinking that had gone all the way to the end of what it was trying to say, rather than stopping at the comfortable limit. She saved it. She did not send it anywhere yet. It needed another day, maybe two, of sitting with it, returning to it with fresh eyes, hearing where it was soft when it should be firm or firm when it should have more space to breathe. She knew from long practice that the writing was done when the reading stopped making her want to change things, and she was not there yet. She made dinner, something simple, eggs and bread and the last of the week's greens, and ate at the kitchen table looking at the flowers she had bought at the market, which had opened slightly in the warmth of the flat, and were now generously, unself-consciously themselves. She thought about all the things she was going to do differently, not dramatically differently. The life she was building was fundamentally the right life. She had known this for some time, but the edges of it, the specific rooms she entered, and the specific invitations she accepted, and the specific spaces where she spent the energy that was, she now understood more clearly than before, not an infinite resource. Those needed adjusting. She was going to say no more often. Not to everything. She was not retreating, not hardening herself against the world. She was simply going to apply, more consistently and more rigorously, the question she had asked herself less often than she should have. Does this room know what I am? If the answer was no, and the room did not appear to be the kind that was in the process of learning, then no was the right response to the invitation. She was going to say yes to Constance Albright and the lunch they had agreed to have, because Constance was someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. She was going to say yes to Noel Whitfield when he called because she had a feeling, precise and reliable, the kind she had learned to trust, that something good was going to come from that conversation. She was going to say yes to Francis Webb if she ever reached out, because she had the energy of someone who did real work and cared about it. She was going to say yes to Henry Brace and whatever he was working on, because the documentary filmmaker with the story about the valley had a quality she recognized, genuine interest in things beyond himself. She was going to pour all of that saved energy, the energy she had spent, over the years, on rooms that required her to prove herself before she could simply exist, into the work, into the writing, into the pieces she had been circling for months, and had not yet found the courage to finish, into the essay that was now sitting in a file on her laptop, more complete and more true than anything she had written in a long time. She washed her plate and her mug. She watered the plant on the windowsill, the one that was leaning toward the light, already committed to its direction. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was unusual for her. She lay in the dark and thought, for a few minutes, about Lord Ashfield. She wondered if he had thought about her at all on his Sunday, if she had crossed his mind even once since the previous evening. She suspected not. She was not his problem to solve, was not his lesson to learn, was not the subject of whatever version of Sunday morning he was moving through in his own part of the city. He had called her the other one, and she had smiled and he had moved on, and his Sunday was probably, from his perspective, unrelated to any of it. This did not make her feel worse. It made her feel clearer. Because the work she was doing, the internal work, the decision-making, the adjusting of the edges of her life, none of it required him to know about it, or acknowledge it, or understand it. It was not aimed at him. It had nothing to do with him at all, really, except that he had been the occasion for it, a catalyst, an event that had caused a reaction in the correct direction. She had been moving toward this direction for years. He had simply been the friction that finally got her there. She closed her eyes. The city made its Sunday night sounds outside the window. The flowers on the kitchen windowsill were still open in the warmth of the flat. The notebook on the desk held 3 lines in her handwriting that together said something she had needed to say. She slept well. She almost always did, on nights when she had been honest. The first invitation arrived on Wednesday. It came in the form of an email forwarded from the Margins general inbox, passed along by her editor with a brief note. "This came for you, FYI." She opened it and read, Lord Ashfield was hosting a dinner the following month in connection with a different charitable foundation. This one focused on arts education in under-resourced schools. She was being invited as a journalist and writer whose work was felt to be relevant to the evening's themes. The email was courteous, impersonal, and gave no indication that anyone writing it was aware of any previous connection between the person receiving it and the person hosting it. She read the email twice. She thought about the children in the arts education program. She thought about the work those schools were doing. She thought about whether attending this dinner would be useful to the charity's work or to her own, and whether the distinction mattered, and decided that it did. She wrote a reply. She thanked the organizer genuinely for the invitation and declined it, citing prior commitments. This was not entirely true. Her diary for that evening was not yet full, but it was true in the most important sense. She had a prior commitment to the version of herself she was building, and that commitment had no exceptions for dinners hosted by men who saw categories where there were people. She did not explain any of this in the email. She simply declined, politely, warmly, without drama. She sent it and returned to the piece she had been editing. The second invitation came 10 days after the first. This one was personal. Not a forwarded email but a handwritten note on heavy card, delivered to the Margin's office with her name on the envelope in a hand she did not recognize. The note was brief. It said that Lord Ashfield was hosting a small gathering the following Sunday, a lunch, not a formal event, and that he very much hoped she would be able to attend. Several people she might find interesting would be present. He signed it with his full name and title. She read the note 3 times, not because it required 3 readings, but because she was paying close attention to how she felt while reading it. She was checking for anger. There was very little, as before. She was checking for temptation. There was some. She admitted to herself honestly, because the instinct to be wanted by the rooms that have previously dismissed you is a human instinct, and she was human. She was checking for the particular pull of wanting him to understand what he had done, which would require her attendance, which would be giving him more of her energy than he deserved. The anger was small. The temptation was real but manageable. The desire to be understood was present and noted and then firmly set aside, because she had made her peace with Constance's assessment. He would not understand. Not because he was a bad person, but because he did not have the particular kind of attention that understanding required. She wrote a second reply. This one took a little longer to get right. She thanked him for the invitation. She said it was very kind. She said that her schedule did not permit her to attend, and that she hoped the lunch went well. She said nothing further. She signed her name simply, Marguerite Slade. She sealed the note and gave it to the receptionist to post, and went back to her desk and sat down and thought about something she had read a long time ago. Something about how the most powerful response to being treated as less than you are is not a speech or a demonstration but a quiet, consistent refusal to accept the terms. She could not remember who had written it. It did not matter. The thing itself was true. Owen knocked on the door of her small office. He was carrying 2 coffees, which was his way of asking if she had 5 minutes without making it an obligation. She gestured at the chair opposite her desk and he came in and sat down. "You look like you're thinking about something significant," he said, setting a coffee in front of her. "I am," she said. "Or rather, I've finished thinking about it and I'm sitting with the result." "Good result?" "Yes. Uncomfortable in some ways, but yes." He nodded. He was good at nodding, in a way that made it clear he was listening, without pressing for more than you were offering. She had said this to him once and he had seemed genuinely surprised, which suggested it was so natural to him that he was unaware of it as a skill. "Can I show you something?" she asked. She pulled up the essay on her laptop and turned the screen toward him. He read. He read the way he read photographs, with the concentrated attention of someone who is looking for what the thing is actually saying beneath what it appears to be presenting. He did not comment as he read. He did not make the sounds that some people make when reading, small affirmations to signal their engagement. He read in silence for several minutes. When he was done, he looked up and said, "This is the best thing you've written." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "Not the best structured or the most argued. The most true. You can feel the difference. There's no performance in this one. It's just what it is." She had known Owen for 2 years, and in that time he had given her exactly 3 genuine compliments. Genuine in the sense that they were not socially motivated, not softening for a criticism, not part of the normal currency of collegial politeness. She had noted each one because they were so clearly different from the ordinary social variety. This was the third. "Thank you," she said. "Are you going to publish it?" "I think so. Not here. It's too personal for the Margin. Maybe somewhere that has more room for this kind of thing." He nodded. "Send it to Eleanor at Proximity. She's been asking you for something for months." Eleanor Marsh was the editor of Proximity. a long-form magazine that published the kind of writing Marguerite respected most, essays and journalism and reported pieces that were long enough to go somewhere real, rather than just visiting the idea of somewhere. Eleanor had sent her occasional notes over the past 2 years, each one a slightly different version of the same message. When you have something that feels too big for the margin, send it to me. She had filed those notes away with the same patient attention she brought to most things, and now the thing had arrived. She sent the essay to Eleanor 3 days after that, with a brief cover note that said, "Here is the piece that was too big." Eleanor replied within an hour, "This is extraordinary. When can you talk?" They spoke that afternoon on the phone. Eleanor had questions and suggestions that were specific and useful in the way that good editorial instinct always is, not trying to make the piece into something else, but trying to make it more fully what it already was. She pushed Marguerite on the middle section, where the argument thinned slightly, and she was right. She asked her to give more to the ending, where the resolution came slightly too quickly after the difficulty, and she was right about that too. Marguerite spent 2 more days on the essay and sent it back. Eleanor accepted it. The piece was published 6 weeks later. It ran under the title, "The Room That Knows Your Name, and What Happens When You Leave the One That Doesn't." The response was, she had not expected this. She had expected some response. She knew, from previous essays, that certain kinds of personal writing that named specific experiences reached people in a specific way. But she had not expected the particular volume of it, or the particular quality. Emails arrived in her inbox from women who described, with the precision of people who had been waiting to say this out loud for a long time, exactly the feeling she had tried to articulate. Women who had been in rooms where they were the other one. Women who had smiled in exactly the way she had described, without ever having named it that way before. Women who had left and built something and wanted her to know. Men wrote too. Some of them in defensiveness, which she had anticipated, and which she read without much feeling and did not reply to. But some of them wrote with a kind of honest bewilderment that she found more interesting. Men who said that they had not known about this particular dynamic, had not understood the weight of it, and were trying now, in the light of her essay, to think about what they might have done or said that had had a similar quality without their having seen it at the time. She replied to some of those, carefully, without anger and without too much grace. She did not want to be more generous with that kind of effort than the situation required, but she replied, because honesty meeting itself is worth a response. Clara called her the morning the piece went live, before she had even read it herself in its published form. "I'm reading it," Clara said, without preamble. "Don't talk, I'm reading." She did not talk. She waited. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and her grandmother's earrings. She had taken to wearing them more often, not all the time but often, and she waited for Clara to finish. When Clara came back on the phone, she said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual voice, "Marguerite." "Yes." "I have been your friend for 14 years. I know. This is the truest thing I have ever read, and I have read a great deal of true things." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." "No," Clara said. "Thank you for writing it. Thank you for—" She paused, and Marguerite heard her take a breath. "For naming it. I felt that room. That specific room where someone decides what you are before you've said a word. I felt that smile. I've produced that smile. And I didn't have a name for it until you gave me one. That matters." She thought about what her mother had said about her grandmother, certain, even when she wasn't. She thought about the 3 lines in her notebook. She thought about the plant on the windowsill still leaning in its committed way toward the source of what it needed. "I know," she said. "That's why I wrote it." Later that day, the same afternoon the essay went live, a second note arrived at the Margin's offices. This one was also handwritten, on the same heavy card as before, in the same unrecognized hand. She opened it. It said, "I have read your piece in proximity. I believe I owe you an apology. I wonder if you might be willing to meet for coffee so that I might offer one in person. I understand entirely if you prefer not. Ashfield." She read the note twice. She sat with it for a long time. Outside her window, the city went on doing what it always did, the ordinary noise and motion of a world that was not particularly concerned with any of this. She thought about what the note was. She thought about what it was not. It was a man who had been moved to some form of recognition, which she did not wish to dismiss, because recognition, genuine recognition, of even partial scope, was not nothing. It was also a man who assumed that his readiness to apologize was an event she should organize her time around, which was its own kind of assumption. She thought about what she wanted. She examined this carefully, without judgment, because wanting things was not something to be ashamed of, and knowing what you actually wanted was a skill it had taken her years to develop. She decided she did not want the coffee. She did not want the apology delivered in person. She did not need to sit across from him and receive his recognition in order for her own sense of what had happened to be valid. It had always been valid. His acknowledgement of it did not make it more true or more real. It made it perhaps more comfortable for him. But his comfort was not her responsibility. She wrote back. The note was brief. She said she was grateful that he had read the piece, and that she was glad it had been useful, and that she hoped the arts education program was doing well. She signed it with her name. She sealed it and posted it. She did not hear from him again. 3 weeks after the essay was published, Marguerite had lunch with Constance Albright. They met at a restaurant that Constance had chosen, a small Italian place near the Baroness's home, unassuming in the way that places with genuinely good food often are, with paper tablecloths and a waiter who greeted Constance by name and brought a small plate of something to the table before they had even opened the menu. Constance arrived exactly on time, which Marguerite noted with a kind of warm recognition. A woman who respects her own time and yours. She was wearing a coat the color of dark honey, and she sat down with the deliberate ease of someone who has decided they will move at their own speed and the world can adjust. I read your essay, Constance said, before they had even looked at the menu. I gathered you might, Marguerite said. It was very good. Thank you. Not a compliment, an assessment. There's a difference. Constance looked at the menu briefly and then put it down, in the manner of someone who already knows what they want or who does not particularly care. Either option being satisfactory. You wrote about that evening. I wrote about something that evening made clear to me. The evening was the occasion, not the subject. Constance nodded slowly. Yes, I understood that. The piece is about a pattern, not a person, which is why it will last. She picked up her water glass. He wrote to you, I hear. Marguerite looked at her. How do you know that? He told me. We sit on the same charitable board, the arts education one. He mentioned it in passing. He seemed not precisely chastened. That might be an overstatement, but more aware than usual. He asked me for coffee, Marguerite said. And you declined. And I declined. Constance looked at her with the assessing quality that Marguerite had come to recognize as the way Constance processed things she was forming a considered view on. Do you want to know what I think about that? Yes. I think it was correct. Not because he doesn't deserve the opportunity to apologize. He probably does, and probably means it. But because you have already spent your energy on the useful version of this experience, which was writing about it, and there would be nothing further to gain from the in-person version except his relief and your time. Marguerite looked at her. That's almost exactly what I thought. Most people who think clearly tend to arrive at the same conclusions, Constance said, with the small, dry precision that was one of the things Marguerite had immediately liked about her. The question is whether they act on them or allow other considerations to override them. You have a tendency to act on them, which is a considerable advantage. The waiter came. They ordered. The restaurant filled up quietly around them with the lunchtime crowd, and the conversation moved the way good conversations do when two people have already established that they are going to be honest with each other, freely, without too much circling, getting to the actual things rather than the surface version of them. Constance talked about her work, not the ceremonial version of her work, not the board positions and the titles and the events, but the actual work. The policy arguments she was still having, at 71, because the systems were wrong and someone had to keep saying so. The young women she had been mentoring for the past decade, and what she had learned from them that she could not have expected. The particular satisfaction of still being useful, of still being in the room where the actual decisions were made, when so many people had underestimated how long she would stay relevant. Marguerite talked about the essay, and about what had come from it, about the responses she had not anticipated, about the recognition that writing something true had a specific, different quality from writing something well, that the best writing was usually both, but that you could write well and not quite reach someone, whereas if you wrote true, the craft became secondary to the transmission. Constance listened to this with the quality she brought to listening, which was the same quality she brought to talking, complete and focused, and without the small social adjustments that other people made, the slight softening of a strong point, or the moderating of a direct opinion. She said what she thought. She expected you to do the same. What are you writing next? Constance asked. Marguerite hesitated. She had something. She had had it for weeks, growing slowly in her notebooks, not yet ready to be discussed but real enough to feel. Something longer, she said, something that will take time. I'm not sure it's an essay. A book? Maybe. I don't know yet. It's early. Constance looked at her for a moment. Have you eaten properly while writing all this? Marguerite laughed. A genuine one. The kind that comes up before you can decide whether it's appropriate. That's a very specific question. I have always found that writers who are working on something important tend to forget to eat. I don't know why this is. Possibly the body treats thinking and eating as competing demands. My advice: eat. Noted, Marguerite said. Thank you. I'm serious, Constance said. The work needs you to be functional. Being useful to your own work is as important as being useful to the reader. This piece of advice was so practical and so inarguable that Marguerite simply accepted it, the way you accept a fact of mathematics. Yes, this is how it works. They had coffee after the meal. The waiter brought small biscuits that neither of them had ordered but that appeared to arrive as a matter of course when Constance was a regular customer. They talked about a book they had both read, different books it turned out, though they had each been under the impression they were discussing the same one, which led to a 5-minute exchange in which they each described their respective books and concluded that they sounded like almost identical titles written from entirely opposing arguments. You should read mine, Constance said. You should read mine, Marguerite said. They exchanged titles. Marguerite wrote hers in the small notebook she kept in her bag. Constance produced a card from her coat pocket and wrote the other title on the back of it, in handwriting so small and precise it seemed almost too formal for a restaurant setting, and handed it to Marguerite. They walked out into the afternoon together. The street was busy with the midday movement of the city. People returning from lunch, a delivery van blocking one lane, a woman pushing a very large pushchair with the determined expression of someone navigating an obstacle course. Constance put on a pair of dark glasses that were deeply elegant. Same time next month? Constance said. I'll check my diary and send you a day. Good. Don't be late. I have limited tolerance for people who treat other people's time as flexible. I know, Marguerite said. I could tell in the first 5 minutes. Constance almost smiled. This, Marguerite had noticed, was the closest the Baroness generally got. Not quite a smile, but the slight movement that said something had landed correctly. She accepted this as the equivalent of a warm laugh from anyone else. They said goodbye and went in opposite directions. Constance toward the narrow street that led to her home, and Marguerite back toward the center and the tube. She walked for a while before finding the station, turning the lunch over in her mind with the satisfied feeling of something that had been worth the time, not just pleasant but useful, the specific richness of a conversation that had given her something to take away and think about. She thought about Constance saying, most people who think clearly tend to arrive at the same conclusions. She thought about what that implied, not that there was one right answer to every question, but that the method of thinking, done honestly and without prior commitment to a preferred conclusion, tended to move things in a direction, and that direction more often than not was toward something simpler and more durable than the complicated, socially mediated answer you might arrive at if you were primarily interested in keeping everyone comfortable. She had declined the coffee with Ashfield because it was the correct thing to do, not the kind thing, not the gracious thing, not the thing that would make anyone else feel good about the situation. The correct thing for her own integrity and her own time and her own energy. She thought about all the times over the years she had done the kind thing instead of the correct thing. The times she had attended events that cost her more than they gave her. The times she had accepted invitations that were extended not from genuine desire for her company, but from the vague social obligation to extend them. The times she had smiled and stayed, and been accommodating in situations that had not deserved her accommodation. Not anymore, or at least, far less. She was going to spend the next years of her life applying the same standard she had applied to Lord Ashfield's invitation to coffee. Not what is polite, not what is expected, but what is correct. She walked into the tube station and down the escalator and onto the platform. A train was already there. She got on. The doors closed. She found a seat and sat down and got out her notebook and wrote, on a new page, one line, I am spending my energy differently from now on things that know what they are, on work that is true, on people who look at me and see me. She looked at this line for a long time as the train moved through the dark. Then she wrote below it, this is not a revolution. It is simply paying attention to what I already knew. The train came up out of the tunnel into the daylight of the city above. She put the notebook away. She watched the buildings go past and the sky between them, and the people on the platforms at the stations the train passed through, all of them in motion, all of them going somewhere, all of them carrying the interior life that the outside world does not always see. She thought, all of them, every single one, the other one in someone else's quick assessment, and none of them, any of them, only that. The train moved on. The phone call from Noel Whitfield came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the ball. She almost did not pick up. The number was unfamiliar and she had a policy, developed over years of working in media, of letting unfamiliar numbers go to voicemail. but something made her answer. She said her name into the phone and heard a pause that had the quality of someone who had been preparing what to say, and had just arrived at the moment of saying it. "This is Noel Whitfield," he said. "We spoke at the ball." "I remember," she said. "Good. I have a question, and you should feel free to say no, and I mean that with more sincerity than people usually mean it when they say it." "All right. I'm working on something, larger than the Feltham piece, much larger. It's going to be installed in the new wing of the Halcott Gallery. You know the Halcott?" She did. The Halcott was a contemporary art gallery in the east part of the city that had a reputation for giving artists genuine space and genuine freedom, which was rarer than it should have been. "I've been thinking about the piece for 2 years," Noel said, "and I've been writing notes for it and working through the material questions, and I have a clear idea of the physical reality of it. But I've been thinking, and this is the question, that something like this might benefit from a written component. Not an exhibition catalog, not explanatory text, something that exists alongside the work as its own thing, that addresses the same territory the work is addressing without trying to explain the work, because the work doesn't need explaining." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "I read your essay," he said. "Not just the proximity piece. I went back and read your other work. There is a quality in your writing, the way you get at what something means beneath what it appears to mean. That is the same quality I am trying to put into the piece. I think we might be working on the same thing from different materials." She held the phone and thought about his hands, the large, rough hands she had noticed at the ball, the hands of someone who worked. "What territory?" she asked. "What it costs to be looked at without being seen," he said, "and what happens when you stop allowing it." She was quiet for a longer moment. "That's exactly what I've been writing about." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm calling." They talked for an hour. Not about logistics, those came later. Just about the thing itself, about what the work was reaching for and what the writing might be reaching for, and whether they were truly coming from the same place or only appearing to from a distance. By the end of the hour, she was convinced it was the former. She was not someone who made that assessment quickly or carelessly. She said yes. The collaboration that followed was one of the most unusual working experiences of her life. They did not work together in the conventional sense. They did not sit in the same room producing the same thing. Instead, they worked alongside each other with a deliberate separateness, like two people walking the same path at slightly different paces and occasionally comparing what they were seeing. He sent her photographs of the work as it developed, the iron and stone taking shape in his studio over the following months, and she sent him drafts of what she was writing. They met occasionally for long conversations that were not meetings in the usual sense but more like thinking aloud in the company of someone who was doing the same. She had never worked this way before. She found she loved it. The separateness was important, it turned out. It allowed each thing to be fully itself rather than compromising toward the other. The writing she produced in response to his work was the most independent writing she had ever done, the least influenced by what she imagined the reader would want. She wrote into the space his work was creating, and the space was wide and undemanding and did not require her to make herself smaller to fit it. During the months of that collaboration, several other things were happening simultaneously that she was paying attention to at different levels of focus. The proximity essay continued to move through the world. It was shared, reread, talked about. A feature writer at a national newspaper contacted her about a profile. She agreed to it after thinking for a week, because profiles were a category she had always been cautious about and needed to be clear-headed entering. The feature ran and was generous and accurate, neither of which she had taken for granted going in. It brought her work to a wider audience, which was useful, and which she received with the particular calm of someone who had already decided what the work was for before anyone else began to read it. Frances Webb, the fundraising consultant she had met at the ball, reached out 3 months after the event to say that she had read the essay and to ask if Marguerite had any interest in advising on communication for the children's medical program. It was not a formal offer, Frances was clear about that, but a question, an opening. Marguerite thought about it and said yes to a single meeting, which turned into 2, which turned into something she had not expected, a genuine interest in how organizations that do good work communicate what they do and why it matters, and whether the writing skills she had spent years developing could be useful in that direction. This was a new thread and she pulled at it carefully, not wanting to follow it so far that it pulled her away from her central work, but interested in where it went. It went, over the following year, to 3 collaborative projects with charitable organizations whose work she cared about, not writing their communications for them, but helping them find the language for what they already knew. It was a different kind of writing from her essays and her journalism, but it drew on the same fundamental thing, the ability to see what something actually meant and say it in a way that someone else could receive. Henry Brace, the documentary filmmaker from her dinner table at the ball, called her 6 weeks after the event. He was making a film. The film was about women who had worked in their fields for decades without receiving the recognition that the quality of their work warranted, and about what that had cost them and what they had built regardless. He had been thinking about the angle since before the ball, he said, and the essay had confirmed something for him about how to approach it. He wanted to interview her, not as a subject of the film. She was not old enough or obscure enough to fit the particular profile he was building, but as a voice in it. Someone who could speak to what it felt like from a particular vantage point. She asked for several days to think about it, and he gave them without pressure. She thought about what being filmed involved, what it meant to have her face and her voice in something that would move through the world in ways she could not predict or control. She thought about whether she was the right person to speak to the experiences he was documenting. She thought about the women whose stories he was telling, and whether having her as a voice would serve those stories or distract from them. She said yes, with a condition. She wanted to see the rough cut before agreeing to the final version. He agreed immediately, and without qualification, which she took as a sign that he meant what he said about the kind of filmmaker he was. She did the interview on a Friday afternoon in January, in the sitting room of her flat, which was the location Henry had suggested, and which made sense. The most natural version of herself was the version that existed in the space she had made for herself. The camera was operated by a woman named Ruth, who had the quiet, precise manner of someone who was very good at being unobtrusive. Henry asked questions and listened to the answers with the genuine focus she had noticed in him at the dinner table, not waiting for you to finish so that he could say the next thing, but actually taking in what you were saying. She talked for 2 hours. She talked about the essay, and about what had led to it. She talked about what it felt like to be partially seen. She talked about the decision she had made, and what it had cost and what it had freed. And she talked about her grandmother and the pearl earrings and what Elaine had said about the way they both walked, certain, even when they weren't. She talked about Noel Whitfield and the collaboration and what it had taught her about working alongside someone without trying to merge with them. She did not talk about Lord Ashfield by name. She had thought carefully about this before the interview and had decided that naming him would make the story about him, which would be the wrong emphasis. He was not the subject. He was the occasion. When it was over and Ruth was packing up the camera, Henry said, "Not recording, just between them. Thank you for that. It was exactly what the film needed, which is someone who has thought about this clearly and is willing to say what they think." "I'm always willing to say what I think," she said. "I've found that it makes things much simpler." He smiled. "Most people are afraid of what becomes visible when they say it." "I know," she said. "I was, for a long time. And then I realized that the things I was most afraid to say were also the truest, and that speaking them was how I found out whether the truth could hold its own weight. It usually can." He nodded. They shook hands. He and Ruth left, and she stood in her sitting room looking at where the camera had been. Outside it was January cold, the kind that made the city feel stripped down to its bones. No leaves on the trees, the sky a flat pale gray, the light thin and horizontal. She went to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window looking at the street. She thought about the past 3 months. She thought about what she had said yes to and what she had said no to. She thought about the essay and the collaboration with Noel and the lunch with Constance and the conversation with Henry. She thought about the morning on her birthday balcony and the cold tea and the notebook entry and the decision she had not quite made yet, sitting with her first cup of the morning, not knowing how close it was. She had said no to Ashfield's dinner. She had said no to his request for coffee. She had said no to 3 events in that general social circle that had invited her in the weeks following the proximity publication, when her name was more visible and the invitations were more frequent. She had said no cleanly and without hesitation, and without the elaborate justifications she used to produce when declining things she did not want to do, as though not wanting something was not in itself a sufficient reason. She had said yes to the people who saw her, to Constance and Noel and Francis and Henry and Owen in the next office with his quality of listening. She had said yes to the work, the real work, the work she believed in, the essay and the collaboration and the longer things she was slowly building that did not yet have a name but was real in the way things are real before they are finished. She had done all of this in 3 months. The months had felt both very fast and very spacious. The spaciousness came, she understood now, from the energy she was no longer spending on the wrong rooms. That energy had gone elsewhere, into the work, into the friendships, into the thinking, into the particular quality of attention she was bringing to her own life, not in a navel-gazing way, not with excessive self-focus, but with the simple recognition that her life was her responsibility, and she could be deliberate about it, or she could let it be shaped by the path of least resistance. and she had tried the second way long enough to know it did not suit her. She drank her tea and looked at the January street, and felt something she had been trying, for years, to reliably access: simple clarity about who she was and what she was doing and why. The kind of clarity that does not require circumstances to be perfect or others to understand or the world to be organized fairly. The kind that comes from the inside and stays there, regardless. She went back to her desk. She had work to do. She had been having that thought a lot recently. She had work to do. And each time she had it, it arrived not as a burden but as something closer to the feeling the plant on the windowsill must have. The understanding that the light is over there, and that there is nothing to do but lean toward it, steadily and without apology, and let what you are made of determine what you become. She opened her laptop. She started to write. The book, because that was what it was becoming, she had accepted that by February, arrived in pieces that did not always come in order. This was new for her. Her essays had always had a line from the beginning to the end that she followed with some discipline, even when the line bent. The book did not behave this way. It arrived in fragments that she wrote and then had to find the architecture for, the way you might sort a large pile of objects and discover only gradually the system by which they belong together. She had a title, though. That came early. The book was going to be called What You Are Before Someone Names You. She wrote this on a piece of paper and put it on the wall above her desk, not as a reminder but as a compass, the thing to steer toward. What she was trying to do with the book was bigger than what she had done with the essay. The essay had been about a moment and what the moment clarified. The book was about a lifetime of such moments and what they added up to, about what happens to women, to all sorts of people, but she was writing from what she knew. When the version of themselves that exists in other people's assessments and categories and the other one designations is repeatedly offered back to them as though it were the truth, and what it takes to hold on to what was there before any of that, and what it costs, and what it builds. She worked on it in the mornings, before the editorial work at the margin began. She had renegotiated her hours slightly, coming in later on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which gave her the long morning stretch that the book required. Her editor, a patient and clever man named Gordon, had agreed without difficulty. Gordon was one of those editors who understood that writers who did their best work did not do it by being available every hour of every day, and who structured his expectations accordingly. She had always appreciated this about him. She appreciated it more now. Clara read the first chapters in March. She read them at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Marguerite sat opposite her, not reading but not pretending to do something else either, just sitting with her tea, watching Clara's face, which was a reliable instrument for what was actually there. When Clara put the pages down, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's bigger than the essay. That's what I've been trying to say in our last 3 conversations. No, I understood you intellectually. I mean that reading it is bigger. There's more room in it, more space for the reader to stand in." She picked up her own tea. "I have a question, which might be a hard question. Go on. The chapter about your father, where he leaves on the Tuesday morning and never explains himself. Are you going to include that?" Marguerite had written it. She had not been sure she was going to include it. It sat in a folder labeled with a question mark, which was her shorthand for not yet decided. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "It's the best thing in the chapters you showed me," Clara said. "It's where the book comes from, I think. The Tuesday morning is where the whole thing starts, the learning that people can look at you and simply decide you're not worth coming back for. All the rooms after that are just bigger versions of the same moment." Marguerite was quiet. She had thought something adjacent to this. She had not yet let herself think it this directly. "That's harder to write than the essay," she said. "I know. My mother would read it." "I know," Clara said again, and her voice was careful now, gentle in the way it only was when something really mattered. What would she think? Marguerite thought about Elaine, about the small house in Weston and the post office and the packed lunches left on the counter without comment, and the pearl earrings wrapped in tissue paper in a small box posted to arrive by Friday, about the call on her birthday morning when Elaine had said, "Wear the navy dress, it makes you look like yourself." She would think it was true, Marguerite said. She wouldn't love it, but she would know it was true. Would that be enough? "Yes," Marguerite said. "I think it would." She included the chapter. She worked on it for 6 weeks, making it better and harder and truer, until it had the quality that all the best things she had written had in common. It felt, reading it back, not as though she had constructed something, but as though she had uncovered something that had already been there, waiting. In April, Noel Whitfield's installation opened at the Halcott Gallery. She had seen it in its near-finished state 2 weeks before the opening, going to his studio in the early evening to see it in the particular light it would be installed in, and she had stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. It was enormous, much larger than she had understood from the photographs he had sent. Iron and stone, the way the Feltham piece had been. But this one had a quality of being assembled from things that had been found rather than made, which was not literally true but was aesthetically true, which was the more important kind. It had a name. The name was, Before You Looked. She had read the name in a message from Noel the previous week and had sat with it for a while before she said, in her reply, that it was exactly right. And it was. It captured precisely what the work was doing. The idea that there was a person there before anyone's gaze arrived to redefine them, and that the person's task was to maintain contact with that original self regardless of what the looking tried to impose. She had finished her written piece to accompany the installation. It was not part of the exhibition catalog. As Noel had said from the beginning, it was something separate, a thing that existed in conversation with the work rather than an explanation of it. It was published in proximity again, running the same week as the opening, and the two things, the installation and the essay, were reviewed together in several places, which produced the particular critical interest that arises when two separate works are seen to be addressing the same territory from different angles. The opening was on a Wednesday evening. She arrived early, which was unusual for her at events of this kind, but this was not like other events. She wanted to see the installation in the gallery before it filled up with people. She wanted to see it in the right way first, with the full attention it deserved. She stood in front of Before You Looked for 20 minutes. The gallery was still quiet around her. A few staff members, Noel himself somewhere in another room, the hum of the ventilation and the occasional sound of voices being tested against the acoustics. She stood and looked and let the looking do its work. The iron had a quality she had tried to describe in her writing and had only partially succeeded with. It was not cold, though iron should be cold. It held, somehow, a warmth. The stone at its base was dark and smooth and very heavy-looking. The spaces between the components of the structure, the deliberate gaps, the places where she would have expected material and where Noel had left nothing, were where the work held its breath. She had written about this. She had written that the spaces were not absence but attention, the place where the eye went and was invited to bring its own content, its own history, its own version of what was being held there. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about Elaine and her plain-spoken wisdom. She thought about Clara and the Saturday morning with the pages spread on the kitchen table. She thought about Constance Albright walking through a room full of people who had underestimated how long she would remain relevant and not adjusting her pace to accommodate their error. She thought about a man at a ball who had looked at her and said the other one, and who had become, not through any intention of his own, not through any deserving of it, the occasion for all of this. The installation, the book, the essay, the collaborations, the decisions, the direction. She thought, none of this is about him, all of it was in me already. He was just the moment I stopped pretending otherwise. She heard footsteps and turned. Noel had come into the gallery room. He stood a few feet away, looking not at the installation but at her looking at it, which was a different thing. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Yes," he said. He was not modest about his work in the way that some artists performed modesty. He simply agreed when something was true. "The spaces are right," she said. "I thought about what you wrote," he said. "About what the spaces are holding. I wasn't sure you were right when you first said it. I thought about it for 2 months, then I knew you were right." She looked at him. "The Feltham piece," she said. "The one I reviewed." "Yes. I wrote a better piece about the one I didn't review." "Yes," he said again, with the quality of someone confirming a mathematical equation. "That's usually how it works." They stood in the quiet of the gallery in front of Before You Looked, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was exactly the right thing to do. Then the doors opened for the evening and the room began to fill. She stood at the edge of the room later, with a glass in her hand, watching the people move around the installation. All kinds of people, some of them recognizable from the art world, some of them not, some of them clearly at a gallery opening for the first time, and navigating it with the slightly uncertain energy of someone who is not sure of the choreography but is genuinely trying. She watched them stand in front of the work and look, and she watched their faces do the thing that faces do when they are encountering something real. A small, involuntary adjusting. Not understanding. Understanding was the wrong word. Recognition. The thing that happens when you see something that has been true without being named. She drank her wine and watched and felt, with the clean satisfaction of someone who has done what they came to do, that she was exactly where she should be. Not in a room that did not know her name. In the room that did. The book took 16 months to write. This was not a long time for a book of its kind, or so Gordon told her when he read the completed manuscript and called her, slightly unusually at 8 in the morning, to say that it was finished, and that she should know that. She had been at her desk when the call came, drinking tea, reading back over a chapter she had been unsatisfied with the previous evening. She answered the phone and heard Gordon's voice saying, without preamble, "This is the best thing you've ever written." She put down her mug. "Good morning, Gordon. I read it last night, all of it, in one sitting, which is not something I do with manuscripts as a general principle. I appreciate that. The chapter about your father is the core of it. I want you to know I read it 3 times, not because it was unclear, because I needed to." She was quiet for a moment. She had sent the manuscript to Gordon with the particular terror that accompanies sending a piece of work that is genuinely true. There is a specific vulnerability in honest writing that is different from the vulnerability of other kinds, not the anxiety of being wrong, which can be addressed with evidence, but the anxiety of having said the real thing, and now having to stand with having said it. "Is it too much?" she asked. She had asked herself this question for 16 months. She was asking it of Gordon now because he would tell her the truth. "No," he said, "it's exactly enough. There's not a sentence in it that doesn't earn its place." She let out a breath she had been holding for a long time. Not entirely releasing it, the book was not yet published, and publication was its own form of putting something into the world that you could not take back, but releasing some of it, enough to breathe properly. The book was called What You Are Before Someone Names You. The cover, which the publisher's design department spent 3 weeks on before getting right, was almost entirely white, with the title in a fine, plain typeface in the lower third. The effect was of a page that had been mostly left empty, waiting perhaps for what the reader would bring to it. She had approved it on the first look and said nothing needed changing, which surprised the designer, who had been prepared for a longer conversation. It was published in September, almost exactly 1 year after the ball at Harwick House. She did not plan that alignment deliberately. She only noticed it afterward, when Clara pointed it out on the phone the evening before the publication date. "You realize, tomorrow is almost exactly a year." She had done the arithmetic and found it was true. 2 days off a full year. She had found this, once she noticed it, not particularly meaningful in a mystical sense, but satisfying in the way that shapes that resolve themselves can be satisfying. A year. She had taken 1 season at that ball and turned it into a book in 1 year, and the book was, she believed, the best thing she had done. The publication of a book is a different experience from the publication of an essay. An essay, even one that reaches people, is consumed in a sitting and then released into the general flow of things. A book requires a different kind of attention from its readers and produces a different kind of response, slower, more accumulated, coming from readers who have spent time with a thing rather than hours. The responses came, not in a flood. That was not the quality of this book's reception, which was more like a tide coming in steadily over weeks rather than arriving all at once. But they came, and they had the particular quality she had learned to recognize as the sign that a piece of work had gone where she had hoped. They came from the specific and the real, from people who had felt something in a particular passage rather than the book in general, who wrote to say not "I liked it, but this line on page 84, or the chapter about the Tuesday morning, or the passage about what your grandmother's earrings felt like in your hand." One letter arrived on paper, not email, actual paper, in an envelope, in the post. This was unusual enough that she turned it over twice before opening it. The handwriting was small and precise and already familiar to her. Constance Albright had read the book and she had taken the time to write a letter. The letter was 3 pages. It was the most considered piece of criticism she received about the book, not the most positive, but the most considered, and it engaged with the argument of the book rather than simply its emotional effect. Constance had thoughts about the chapter on institutional structures, and whether Marguerite's analysis was too focused on individual response at the expense of structural remedy. She had thoughts about the ending, which she found slightly too resolved given the difficulty of what had preceded it. She also said, in the second-to-last paragraph, that the Tuesday morning chapter was one of the finest pieces of personal writing she had read in 20 years. Marguerite read the letter twice and then sat down and wrote back, taking Constance's points seriously, and pushing back on some of them and accepting others, because Constance was right about some things and wrong about 1 or 2, and a conversation was only worth having if both people meant it. She saw Noel twice during the month the book came out. They had fallen into a comfortable, infrequent pattern of meeting, coffee sometimes, a visit to his studio when he had something he wanted her to see, occasional long phone calls that served the same function as the conversations had served during the collaboration, thinking aloud in the company of someone who was doing the same. He came to the book launch that the publisher organized, which was a small, spare event in a room at the Halcott Gallery that had been a deliberate choice, not a bookshop, not a literary event venue, but the same space where Before You Looked was still installed, because the two things were in conversation, and it felt right to have the conversation happen in both their presences. He gave her a small piece of stone at the launch. Not worked, just a piece of stone, from the quarry where he had sourced the material for the installation. The stone was smooth on one side and rough on the other, the way things are before someone finishes them. He gave it to her without ceremony, just placed it in her hand at the end of the event when most people had gone, and said, "For the desk, something to hold when the work is hard." She put it on her desk. She held it sometimes, when the work was hard. It was exactly the right weight. Owen came to the launch too. He took photographs, which was his nature and his gift, and several of them were very good in the way his photographs always were. Not the posed version of the event, but the real one. The moments between the moments that were for official record. He gave her a print of one of them afterward. She is standing at the installation in the photograph, looking up at the iron structure, not posing, not aware of the camera. She looks, he said, when he gave it to her, exactly like herself. She put it on the windowsill next to the plant that was still leaning toward the light. Her mother came for the launch. This had not been certain until 2 days before. Elaine was not someone who easily left Weston for the city, and she was not someone who attended the kinds of events that required formal clothes and the management of strangers. But she had said, when Marguerite asked, "It's your book, isn't it? Of course I'm coming." She arrived on the afternoon train, and Marguerite met her at the station. They had tea in a cafe near the station before the event, in a window seat from which they could watch the street go past. Elaine was wearing a coat Marguerite did not recognize, which meant she had bought something new for the occasion, which was as significant a gesture as Elaine generally made. "Have you read it?" Marguerite asked. "Last week," Elaine said. "All of it." "And?" A pause. Elaine looked out the window at the street. A man walked past with a small child on his shoulders. A woman on a bicycle sailed through without braking. "The Tuesday morning chapter," Elaine said. "Yes. I knew it was going in. When you told me you were writing about it, I knew." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Your grandmother would have said the same thing, in different words, because she would have said less, but the same thing." "Were you angry that I wrote about him?" "No," Elaine said, with the simplicity of someone who has had a long time to arrive at a settled view. "He left without explanation. You explained. That seems about right." Marguerite looked at her mother. In the window light of the cafe, Elaine was sharply herself, the small, precise woman who had spent her life making reliable what the people around her needed to be reliable, who had communicated love through parcels and packed lunches and arriving on time and keeping her word. "Thank you," Marguerite said. Elaine picked up her cup. "What for?" "For raising me to be certain even when I wasn't." Elaine looked at her over the cup in the way that meant she was taking something seriously. "I didn't do that," she said. "You came to it yourself. I tried to make sure the floor was solid, so that when you needed to stand on it, it held." Marguerite thought about this on the way to the launch, about what it meant to be raised by a woman who understood that the job of a parent was not to make you confident, but to make the ground beneath you reliable enough that you could find your confidence through your own standing on it. It was not a small thing. It was, she thought, a very large thing that had been done without any language around it, without any named intention, just through the daily practice of it. The launch went well. She spoke for a while, not a reading. She had decided against a reading in favor of something less formal, more like a conversation about what the book was trying to do and where it had come from. People asked questions. Good questions, most of them. The kind that showed they had engaged with the argument rather than simply consumed the experience of the writing. Afterward, standing near the installation, with most of the evening's guests still in the room, she looked for her mother. She found her across the space, standing in front of Before You Looked with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was looking at something real. She was wearing her new coat and her sensible shoes, and she was standing very straight, as she always stood, looking up at the iron and stone with the expression that Marguerite had seen on her face a handful of times in her life, usually at funerals, occasionally at very beautiful things, of someone encountering something that had moved below the surface of what they allowed to be visible. She did not go over. She let her mother look. Noel appeared at Marguerite's elbow. He looked across the room at Elaine. "Your mother," he said, because she had told him who Elaine was. "Yes." He looked for a moment. "She stands the way you do," he said. "That's what I've been told." "It's a very good way to stand," he said. She thought about what Elaine had said in the cafe. "I tried to make sure the floor was solid." She thought about Constance in the restaurant saying, "The certainty comes later." She thought about the ball, a year ago almost to the day, and the man who had not looked at her properly, and what that had set in motion. She thought, all of that is in this room right now. Everything that followed from one careless sentence, 1 year of direction. She was not grateful to him. She would not use that word, but she was clear-eyed about what had happened, and what had happened was that she had gone to a ball and been invisible in the wrong way, and had decided, quietly and irrevocably, to make herself visible in the right way instead. Here was the visibility. Her mother moved, at the center of a room she had built, a book in the world, work that she believed in, a circle of people who knew what she was before she introduced herself. Here was the room that knew her name. She raised her glass slightly, in the direction of no one in particular, and drank. The year that followed the publication was in some ways the most demanding of her life, and in other ways the most clarifying. Demanding because the book had opened more doors than she had expected, and each door required a decision about whether to walk through it, and making decisions with care was not the same as making them quickly. Clarifying because the decisions themselves, made one at a time, with the same standards she had set in the months following the ball, were getting easier. The question was simpler now. Did this room know what she was? If yes, she walked in. If no, she did not. She was invited to speak at a literary festival in the spring. She accepted. The audience was large and attentive, and the conversation she had with the festival's host, a journalist named Will Connolly who had read the book with the density of attention that showed in every question, was one of the best public conversations she had ever been part of. In the green room afterward, Will said, with the plain honesty that she recognized as the same register as her own, "I've been to 100 of these. This is the first one this year that felt real." She was invited to speak at a corporate event. A large financial services company had read the essay, had decided the book was relevant to their people, and had reached out with a generous fee and considerable expectations. She thought carefully about it. She did not dismiss the invitation on grounds of category. That would have been a kind of snobbery that she did not have time for, and financial services workers were people with interior lives like any other people. But she asked careful questions about what was expected, read the brief they sent, and concluded that what they actually wanted was something more like an inspirational keynote than a genuine engagement with the ideas, and that the ideas would not survive the compression. She declined, politely and specifically, explaining her reasons. The organizer seemed surprised to receive a considered response to a rejection. She suspected most people simply said they were unavailable. She was invited to sit on a panel about women in the arts, which she accepted. The panel was good. The other panelists were direct and honest, and the conversation did not stay on the surface. One of the women on the panel, a composer named Ada Lee, became someone she kept in touch with after, meeting occasionally for the kind of long, ranging conversations she had found herself seeking out more deliberately, the kind where something is actually at stake, where both people are thinking as they speak rather than rehearsing positions. She was invited to 2 different charity balls. She declined both without particular drama, offering the standard language of prior commitments and genuine regret. She felt no particular regret. She was not building a public persona in the way that some writers built public personas, as a performance, carefully managed, aimed at a specific audience. She was simply doing her work and saying yes to the things that were in the service of the work, and the relationships that mattered, and no to the things that were not. It was less complicated than she had feared it would be. The complications came mainly from other people's surprise at how clear she was about it, which was a useful reminder that clarity of this kind was apparently rarer than it should have been. In the spring of the second year after the book, something happened that she had not anticipated. She got a letter, again on paper, in the post, a form of correspondence she was beginning to associate with significant things, from a woman she did not know. The letter was long, 5 pages, written in a small, rounded hand on plain notepaper. The woman's name was Patricia, not Patricia Fielding from the bookshop, a different Patricia, and she was 63 years old, and she lived in a small city in the north of England, and she had read What You Are before someone names you in the local library, because she could not afford to buy it, and she had read it twice in the library, and then asked the librarian if she could take it home overnight. She had not written about the book in general terms. She had written about a single chapter, the chapter about Marguerite's grandmother, the earrings, and what had been transmitted across generations of women who had had to learn to take up space. She had written that she had an 18-year-old daughter who had been struggling for 2 years with the particular difficulty of being a young woman who knew her own mind in circumstances that discouraged it. She had read the chapter to her daughter. The daughter had wanted to read the chapter herself. And then the daughter had looked up from the book and said, these were the exact words Patricia had written down because she wanted to remember them. So it's a thing that gets passed on, not the difficulty, the certainty. Patricia's letter had ended. I don't know if this is the kind of thing you hear or if it helps you. I just wanted you to know that somewhere in a library in the north, 2 women are more certain than they were before. I think that's what you were trying to do. I think you did it. She read this letter 4 times. She did not reply immediately. She let it sit on her desk for 3 days, next to the smooth, rough stone from Noel and the photograph that Owen had taken, and the plant leaning at its committed angle toward the window light. And she looked at it occasionally, with the feeling of someone who has received something that requires staying with. On the 3rd day, she wrote back. She thanked Patricia and her daughter by name. She said that yes, it was the kind of thing she heard, and that it helped more than she could easily say, and that the daughter's question, "So it's a thing that gets passed on, not the difficulty but the certainty," was the best summary of the book she had received, more accurate than most of the reviews and considerably shorter. She said that she had started writing the book on the morning after a party, where a man she had never met had looked at her and said the other one as though she were a piece of furniture he was identifying for removal. She said that she had decided, on that morning, to stop spending energy on rooms that required her to prove her existence before the conversation could start. She said that the book was what had come from that decision, and that what had come from it was more than she had expected, and that all of it, including Patricia's letter and the daughter's question, was evidence that the decision had been correct. She said, "Pass this on to your daughter, please. Not the letter. The certainty." She sealed the envelope and put it in the post. That afternoon she went for a walk. It had become one of her reliable practices, when she needed to think without forcing the thinking, when she needed to let the mind settle into whatever it was actually doing beneath the directed surface. She walked through the park, which was in the full surge of spring, the trees doing their most extravagant seasonal work, everything leaning with an abandon that reminded her of nothing so much as that plant on her windowsill. Still there, still committed, now considerably larger than it had been. She walked for an hour and a half. She thought about Patricia's daughter. She thought about her own grandmother. She thought about Elaine and the new coat she had worn to the book launch. She thought about Constance Albright, who was now a genuine and valued friend, and who had recently told her, over their monthly lunch, that she intended to live to 90, and that she had a list of things she still needed to accomplish before then, and that Marguerite was, in the most practical sense, on the list. She thought about all the women, and the men, because it was not only women, though women were the ones she knew best from the inside, who were walking the equivalent of the ball every day, going into rooms that did not see them, producing the smile that came from below the surface, filing the information, continuing. She thought about how many of them had someone beside them who knew what to do with the filed information, who helped them see the decision that was available. Constance, who had simply continued their conversation after the interruption and treated Marguerite as exactly what she was. Clara, who had watched and asked carefully, "What are you going to do?" Owen, who had read the essay and said, "Without social inflation, this is the best thing you've written." She thought about how much those people had mattered, how much the quality of their witness had contributed to her ability to see her own situation clearly. The people who do not soften or obscure or make excuses for the rooms that do not see you. The ones who simply confirm, with their presence and their attention and the way they hold the conversation open, that you are worth seeing. She wanted to write about that too, about the quality of that witness and what it required and what it gave. She made a note in her phone, not enough for an essay yet, barely enough for an entry in her notebook, but enough to save it, enough to mark the thought as worth coming back to. She walked back through the park, past the trees doing their spring extravagance, past the families and the runners and the people sitting on the benches in the thin, clear April light. She went home and made tea and sat at her desk and looked at the stone and the photograph and the plant and the manuscript she was beginning, slowly, in the mornings, with the same patience she had brought to the book, of whatever was coming next. She had work to do. She was, she thought, always going to have work to do. This was not a complaint. This was the best possible fact about her life, that the work was real, that there was always more of it, and that she was, with each year, better equipped to do it. She opened her notebook and wrote the note from the walk in full. Then she turned to a new page and sat for a while with the blank white of it. Then she wrote, "So it's a thing that gets passed on, not the difficulty, the certainty." She looked at the line. Then she began. 3 years after the ball at Harwick House, Marguerite received an invitation that was different from all the others. It did not come from a social circle or a charity or an institution, whose gaze she had already assessed and found wanting. It came from a university in the west of the country, a research university with a strong humanities faculty and a recently established center for the study of narrative and social representation, which was a formal name for the serious intellectual work of understanding how stories shape the way people are seen and treated. The center's director was a woman named Dr. Lydia Holt, no relation to the Mr. Holt who had taught her in secondary school, though the name gave her a small, private flicker of something when she first read it. who had published an important book on the construction of female identity in public life, and who had, evidently, been following Marguerite's work for some time. The invitation was to give a lecture. Not a talk, not a conversation, not a panel. A lecture, the formal kind. The kind that was recorded and posted online and sometimes published in collections afterward. The subject was left entirely to her. Dr. Holt's email said simply, "We have been reading your work carefully and believe you have something important to say to our students and researchers. We would welcome you to say it in whatever form feels right to you." She read the email twice. She felt something she had been feeling increasingly often over the past year. The sense that the rooms coming to find her now were the right ones. Not because they were prestigious, though some of them were, but because they were rooms where the conversation was going to be real, where the people in them had already done the work of taking the ideas seriously before she arrived. She wrote back to Dr. Holt and said yes. She spent 6 weeks preparing the lecture. This was longer than she usually spent preparing public talks, but a lecture was different from a talk. A lecture required an argument, a structure, a destination. It required her to know not just what she thought but why she thought it, and how she had arrived at thinking it, and what followed from it, if you accepted it. It required her to do what her best writing always required, go all the way to the end rather than stopping at the comfortable limit. The lecture was about visibility, not the kind discussed in marketing or social media, not the visibility of being known or recognized, but the earlier, more fundamental kind, the visibility of being seen, of being looked at by another person in a way that apprehends what is actually there, rather than what the looker is expecting or hoping to find. She wanted to talk about what it meant when that fundamental visibility was withheld or distorted, what it did to a person over time, what strategies people developed to manage the gap between how they were seen and how they actually existed, and what it looked like when someone refused those strategies and found a different way. She was, in the lecture, writing about herself. She had made peace with this. The essay had been about herself. The book had been about herself and her grandmother and her mother, and the whole long line of women behind them. The lecture was going to be too. But she had come to understand, through the responses to the essay and the book, that when you wrote about your own interior life with sufficient precision and honesty, you were not writing about yourself at all. You were writing about the specific version of a human experience that you happened to know from the inside, and the specificity was what made it useful to everyone else. The more precisely you said the particular thing, the wider it reached. She called Constance the week before the lecture. Not for permission. She had long since moved past the stage of needing permission for anything she wrote or said, but because Constance was someone whose opinion she trusted and wanted. "Tell me what you're planning to say," Constance said in her direct way. She told her. She outlined the argument. Constance listened without interrupting. She was capable of this, though she did not always choose it, and when Marguerite was done, there was a brief silence. "The section about strategies," Constance said. "The ones people develop to manage the gap between how they're seen and how they exist. Yes. Be careful there. That section has the potential to be read as prescriptive, as though you're telling people what to do about being seen wrongly. But you're not, are you? No. I'm describing what people do, not recommending any of it. Make sure that distinction is clear in the writing, not just in your intention. The difference between a descriptive argument and a prescriptive one is something academics care about very much, and rightly so." "I know," Marguerite said. "I'll tighten it. Also, the section about your father. I'm not sure I'm including it." "Include it," Constance said. "It's where the argument comes from. Excluding it is the academic version of what you were describing in the book. The gap between how you present yourself and how you actually exist." This landed precisely. She did not say anything for a moment. "You're saying I would be performing coherence rather than demonstrating it," she said. "Yes," Constance said, "and an audience at a research university will be able to feel the difference, even if they can't name it." She included the section about her father. She rewrote it once more, for a different reader than the book had had. Not a general reader, but an academic one. Someone who was going to be thinking about structures and arguments and the intellectual framework underlying the personal account. It was a different kind of writing from the book, more precise in one direction, less literary in another. She worked on it with the same care she brought to everything, which was the only speed she knew. The evening of the lecture, she arrived at the university in the late afternoon, leaving enough time to see the room before it filled. The lecture hall was larger than she had imagined, a proper hall, tiered seating, capacity for a few hundred. She stood at the front of the empty room and looked up at the rows of seats and felt the familiar thread of pre-performance anxiety that she had never entirely managed to eliminate, which she had come to accept as simply the sign that she was doing something that mattered. Dr. Lydia Holt met her in the corridor outside. She was a small, precise woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and an immediate quality of focused engagement that Marguerite recognized from Constance. The quality of someone whose attention, when it was on you, was entirely on you and not simultaneously somewhere else. "I've read your book 3 times, Dr. Holt said. "The Feltham review of my work," Marguerite said, which was the reference to her own essay's joke about herself, and which Dr. Holt understood immediately and laughed at, which told Marguerite everything she needed to know about the quality of the evening ahead. They talked for 20 minutes before the lecture began. Not about the lecture, about Dr. Holt's research, and about a conversation she had been having with a colleague about whether the concept of visibility was fundamentally political or fundamentally philosophical, and whether that distinction was real or useful. Marguerite had thoughts about this, strong thoughts actually. They agreed on the essential question, and disagreed usefully on what the disagreement implied. The audience filed in. Students, researchers, a few faculty members, some people from the university's wider community who had heard and come. She watched them from behind the door that led to the stage and felt the specific quality of the room, its readiness, its density of attention, the thing that happens when a lot of people have come to a place specifically to think. She went out and stood at the lectern. She began. She spoke for just under an hour. She had not used notes, not because she distrusted them, but because she had been through the argument so many times in preparation that it was truly in her. And she found that when things were truly in her, they were better said without the safety of paper between her and the audience. She felt the audience with her throughout, not the flattering kind of attention that comes from people being politely engaged, but the sharper quality of people who are following something and want to know where it goes. She spoke about visibility in its fundamental sense. She spoke about what it felt like to be partially seen. Not her anecdote, the ball, the man, the phrase, she was saving that, but the general architecture of it, the way it works, the way it erodes something over time if you do not find a way to hold your own reality against the pressure of someone else's reduced version of you. She spoke about the strategies, the performing of coherence, the preemptive explanation, the exhausting labor of making yourself legible to people who would not put in the work to look properly. Then she spoke about the alternative. And this was the part she had been sharpest about in the preparation, because she did not want it to sound like advice, here is what to do, because that was the wrong register. It was instead a description of what it looked like when a person refused the labor, when they stopped making themselves more accessible to reductive vision and instead invested the same energy in making themselves more fully, more rigorously, more honestly present to the people and the rooms that were already trying to see them properly. She told the story then. The ball, in the minimum detail necessary, not an extended narrative, but the essential geometry of it. A room, an introduction, a man who had decided in 20 seconds, the phrase, the smile, the decision, made over a cup of cold tea the following morning, about where to put her energy next. She told it plainly, without drama, with the same precision she had brought to the essay and the book. She said, "I am not telling you this as a story about a man who behaved badly, because that is not what it was about. I am telling you this as a story about information, about what you do when someone shows you, clearly and without meaning to, the limits of what they are capable of seeing, and about the decision that follows from that information, not a decision about them, but a decision about yourself, about where you are going to stand, about which rooms you are going to walk into from now on." She paused. She said, "I chose the rooms that already knew my name. I have been choosing them, every day since, and the work that has come from that choice is the best I have ever done." The room was very quiet. She said, "That is all I wanted to tell you. The rest of it, the how, the what it looked like, the particular texture of the years since, is in the book. But the essential thing, the thing I wanted to say in this room to you specifically, is this. The most important decision you will make about how your life goes is not a career decision, or a relationship decision, or a financial decision. It is the decision about where to put your attention, and attention is not neutral. It is the thing you are made of, in a very real sense. Where your attention goes, you go. What you attend to, you become more of. And so the decision about which rooms deserve your presence is not a small social question. It is the central question, and getting it right for yourself, on your own terms, on the basis of what you actually know about where you are seen and where you are not, is the work that underlies all other work." She stopped. She looked out at the room for a moment. The quiet was the particular quiet of a large group of people not wanting to break something. Then she said, simply, "Thank you." The applause that followed was not the polite kind. It was the kind that begins slowly and builds, the kind that has uncertainty in it at first because people are not sure if it is over, and then certainty as it becomes clear that it is. and then the building quality of something that is being released from having been held. She stood at the lectern and received it with the quietness she had learned, not deflecting, not diminishing, not looking away, simply being in it, for the length of time it lasted, and accepting that the work had gone where it was meant to go. Afterward, Dr. Holt shook her hand and said, "That is what I hoped for, and considerably more." A line of students formed to speak with her. She gave each of them the time they needed. Some asked questions about the argument. One asked about the writing process. Two, separately, asked about the specific experience of being in a room where they were not seen and what to do about it, and she spoke to them honestly and specifically, and without the temptation to soften what she actually thought, which was, trust your own assessment of the room, because you are usually right about it, and then spend your energy accordingly. A young man near the end of the line said, "The Tuesday morning chapter in the book, about your father. I read it, and I thought about my own. There's a similar situation in my family. I wanted to say it helped, just that." She looked at him. He was perhaps 20, with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just put it down briefly in the act of saying it. "Thank you for saying it," she said. "I'm glad." He nodded and moved on. She walked out of the university into the night air, which had the cold and the clarity of early autumn. Dr. Holt was with her for part of the walk to where her car was parked, and they talked while they walked about the center's next project and about a conference the following spring to which she was already being considered. The conversation was productive and real, and she made a mental note to follow up. She drove back to the city alone, on roads that were mostly empty at this hour, with the particular quiet of a long drive at night settling around her. She thought about the young man near the end of the line in the Tuesday morning chapter and what he had said. She thought about Patricia's daughter in the north, asking, "So it's a thing that gets passed on, not the difficulty, the certainty?" She thought about Constance, 71 years old, with her list of things she still needed to accomplish. She thought about the ball. She was thinking about it less now, or rather, she was thinking about it differently. Not as the thing that had happened to her, but as the thing that had clarified something already in motion, like a key turning a lock that had already been almost open. Click. That's all. She drove through the night. The city appeared ahead of her, slowly and then all at once in the way cities do when you approach them in the dark. The spread of light against the sky first, then the density of it, then the specific shapes of it resolving as you get closer. She came home. She made tea. She sat at her desk for a while in the quiet of the late night, looking at the things she had arranged there over the years. The stone and the photograph and the notebook and the plant and her grandmother's earrings on the small dish where she always put them. She thought about visibility, not the absence of it for once, the presence. She was, she thought, the most visible she had ever been. Not in the sense of being known widely, though that had increased. In the more important sense, the sense of being seen by the right people, in the right rooms, doing the right work. The sense of being present in her own life, in a way that required no managing of anyone else's vision, no adjustment for the limits of other people's categories, no preemptive performance of coherence, just the work and the people and the rooms that could hold what she was. That was what she had built. Starting from a ball, a careless sentence, a smile from below the surface, a cup of cold tea, and a decision. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. The second book came more slowly. This was something she had been told by writers she admired and had filed away with the mild skepticism you apply to warnings that don't yet apply to you. The second book is harder. Not harder in the sense of being more painful or more resistant, but harder in the structural sense. The first book arrives whole, even if it takes time to write. It is the book you have been making your whole life, assembled from everything you have ever thought and felt and lived. The second book has to be made from what you learned making the first one, and that is a different kind of building material. She knew what she wanted the second book to do. She had known since the spring walk when she had written in her phone, so it's a thing that gets passed on. She wanted to write about the transmission, about what passes between people, not genetically, not through direct instruction, but through something harder to name, the quality of attention a person carries, the way they see the world, the particular shape of how they hold things when things are hard, about how that transmission happens across generations of women who had to be certain before they had any evidence for certainty. Because the evidence was not going to be provided by the world around them, and they understood this and proceeded anyway. It was a bigger book than the first. More researched. She wanted to go outside her own experience and her own family, to find the patterns in other people's stories as well as her own. She began speaking with women of various ages and backgrounds, not for a journalism project but for the thinking the book required. Constance introduced her to 3 women she knew who had navigated similar questions in very different contexts. Frances Webb, the fundraising consultant, had a network of women in charitable work who agreed to speak with her. Dr. Holt connected her with researchers who had done quantitative work on the subject. The data side of something she had been writing about from the inside, the numbers that confirmed what she had known from experience. She organized the research the way she organized the writing, methodically, patiently, without trying to force a shape onto it before the shape was clear. She had learned this from the first book, that the shape of a thing reveals itself through the making of it, and trying to impose the shape in advance results in something that feels constructed rather than discovered. She wanted the second book to feel discovered. She also had the collaboration with Noel continuing in a lower key. He was working on something smaller than the Halcott installation, a sequence of smaller pieces, all related to each other, that he intended to show together. He sent her photographs occasionally. She sent him the pages she thought might interest him, not because she wanted his feedback but because sending them to him was a way of staying in conversation with what had started between them that day at the ball, when she had walked up to him near the window and said, "I think I got your work completely wrong." The collaboration had become, she thought, one of the most important working relationships of her professional life, not because they produced things together, the writing and the sculpture remained separate, but because the conversation between them, running now for 3 years, had given each of them a perspective they would not have had alone. He had a way of seeing things in space that had made her think about the way she structured arguments, the importance of the empty space, the thing you left out. She had, he told her once, given him a more precise language for what he was trying to do, which he had only previously been able to describe by making the work and pointing at it. In the spring of the 3rd year after publication, Clara got a message. Not a message to Marguerite, a message to Clara, from a contact at the newspaper who still attended events in the social circles that Marguerite had declined to return to. The message was not about anything in particular. It was a piece of news, passed along with the casual airlessness that news passed along in those circles usually had. Lord Ashfield was stepping back from several of his board positions. His involvement with the charitable foundations was being reduced. The reason, her contact had said, was unclear, family matters possibly, or simply the general reorganization of his activities that people of his age and position sometimes undertook. Clara told Marguerite about this over their weekly phone call, in passing, without particular emphasis. She included it the way she included any piece of peripheral information, not because it was important but because it was there, and she mentioned things that were there. Marguerite received it with the same equanimity. She noted it. She did not feel anything strong about it in either direction. He was still, from her perspective, simply the occasion, the key that had turned the lock that was already almost open. His subsequent movements through the world were his own business, as they had always been, as her subsequent movements were hers. She said to Clara, "Thank you for telling me." Clara said, "I wasn't sure whether to." "It's fine. It changes nothing." "No," Clara said. "I know." She had not heard from him since his note following the proximity essay. She did not expect to. The note had been his attempt to close a loop that she had not opened, and her reply had been, as gently and as precisely as she could make it, a refusal to participate in the closing. There was no loop. There was simply an event that had happened and what each of them had done with it afterward, and those afterward paths had moved in entirely different directions. She sometimes thought about the question of whether she should have met him for coffee. Not with regret. The decision had been correct, she still believed that, but with the honest acknowledgement that there was another position available, that refusing to meet was its own kind of withholding, that giving someone the opportunity to be better than they had been was not nothing, that forgiveness, or at least the conversation that might make forgiveness possible, was not a cost she should necessarily be too careful with her energy to pay. She had sat with this argument many times, she had engaged with it seriously, and she had arrived, each time, at the same answer. The coffee was not about forgiveness. She had not been holding something against him that needed releasing. She simply did not need the meeting. Forgiveness was not the same thing as debt, and she did not owe anyone the performance of closure at the cost of her own time. She could see him clearly, both what he had done and what he had probably meant by his note, and she could decline the meeting anyway. Seeing someone clearly and choosing not to invest in them were not contradictory positions. She had written about this, actually, in a short piece for the margin, though not about him specifically, about the difference between understanding someone's limitations and taking responsibility for them, about the way the language of grace and forgiveness could be weaponized, often inadvertently, to place obligations on the person who had been wronged, rather than on the person who had done the wronging, about how clarity and forgiveness were different things, and you could have the first without the second, and that was not a moral failure. The piece had produced more argument in the comments section than most things she published in the margin. She had found the argument interesting in proportion to its honesty. The people who pushed back with genuine engagement were grappling with a real question, and she had written several responses that were longer than the original piece. The argument she found most interesting was not the one about whether she was right, but the one about what the alternative looked like. If you did not meet the man for coffee, what did you do instead? She had answered this, in one of her longer responses. You put the energy into the work, the relationships, the rooms that already know your name. Not as a renunciation of grace, but as a choice about where grace was most needed. And the answer, for her, had been clear. She needed to be gracious with herself first, with the self that had spent years in rooms that required proof of existence, and that needed the energy to be redirected rather than spent on one more room of that kind. She did not think he was a bad man. She genuinely did not. She thought he was a man who had operated for decades in a system that had never required him to see certain people clearly, and that this was both understandable and insufficient as an excuse, and that her understanding of the first part did not obligate her to do anything about the second part. This was where she had arrived, 3 years on, and she held that position the way she held the smooth rough stone from Noel's quarry, with a sense of its weight, its realness, the clear fact of it. She was 37 now. The mornings still belonged to the book, the afternoons belonged to the margin and the pieces she was still writing there, and to the conversations and the collaborations and the lunches with Constance. The evenings were sometimes work and sometimes Clara and sometimes a walk through the city that had been her city for almost 20 years now, that she knew deeply, that she walked through with the easy fluency of someone who has memorized a language at the level of the body. She was not someone who looked back very often. She had decided this about herself clearly in the year after the ball, when she had spent the looking back time instead looking forward at what she was going to build, and had found the forward direction considerably more useful. But occasionally, at a particular angle, in a particular light, the way certain things are only visible from a certain angle, she could see the whole shape of it. The shape was, she had gone to a room. The room had not seen her. She had left, and in the leaving had built something larger and more real and more hers than the room had ever deserved to contain. That was all. That was everything. She opened the second book manuscript. She read the last page she had written. Then she picked up her pen and found where the next sentence was waiting and wrote it down. The city outside her window did what cities always do at the hour before the light changes. It held its breath briefly, the way things do just before they become something new. She did not look up. She was already inside the work. The interview request came from a journalist named Patrick Webb, no relation to Francis, who was working on a piece about women writers who had shifted the public conversation on a specific cultural question. He was writing for a magazine that Marguerite had read for years and respected. The piece was going to be a group portrait, he said in his initial email. Several writers whose work had in different ways addressed the experience of being women in public and professional life, and how the experience of writing about it had changed them, and been changed by what they knew. She agreed to the interview. Patrick was thorough and careful in the way that good journalists are. He had read her work closely, not just the essay and the book but the pieces going back several years, and the questions he asked were specific and honest, and not designed to lead her to a position she did not hold. She liked that. She had done enough interviews by this point to know the difference between a journalist who was genuinely interested in what you thought and a journalist who was interested in confirming what they had already decided you thought. They spoke for 2 hours. He asked about the essay and what had preceded it, and how it had changed after publication. He asked about the book and the research for it, and what she had learned from the women she had spoken with that she had not expected to learn. He asked about the collaboration with Noel, which she described with the honest affection she felt for it. And then he asked, "There's a specific event that the essay came from, that you've been oblique about in public. Are you willing to say more about it now?" She considered the question. She had been oblique about the specific details of the ball, not from privacy. She had not been careful about it in any legal or protective sense, but because the specifics had always seemed to her beside the point. The event was not the subject. The pattern was. "There was a party," she said. "I was introduced to a man I had never met. He called me the other one. I smiled. I left the party on my own terms and I decided, the following morning, to stop spending energy on rooms like that one." Patrick was quiet for a moment. "Writing, probably." Then, "That's it?" "That's it." And that was enough to produce. The essay, the book, the lecture, everything that's followed. She thought about this, about whether it was the right framing. "It was the last piece," she said, "not the whole thing. I had been arriving at that decision for a long time. I had been in rooms that didn't see me many times before. This was simply the time I named it and stopped." What made that time different? She had been asked a version of this question before. She had different answers at different times, depending on which part of it she was currently most certain of. Today's answer was, I was ready. Which sounds vague, but I mean it precisely. I had spent enough years building the interior architecture that when I encountered that particular room, I had the place to stand that allowed me to see it clearly rather than being absorbed by it. The essay was already in me. It needed the event to precipitate it, the way certain chemical reactions need a specific condition to begin. Patrick wrote for a moment. And the man? Has there been any further contact? He wrote after the essay, she said. I replied briefly. That was the end of it. No residual feeling about it? She thought honestly. Clarity, she said. A clear view of the thing, without strong feeling attached to it. I am not angry. I am not grateful to him. I am not particularly interested in him. He was the occasion for something that was already happening. That is all he was, and that is more than he might have expected to be, in the end, for my life. The piece ran 6 weeks later. She was one of 5 writers profiled. The portrait of her was accurate, which she had not entirely taken for granted. Patrick had rendered her as she was rather than as a simplified version of it, and the quotes he used were the ones she had meant, not the ones that were more interesting out of context. She wrote to thank him and he replied briefly and collegially. The piece brought a new wave of correspondence. Not the same wave as after the book. That had been its own weather system and had moved through in its own time. This was a smaller, more targeted wave. Journalists, academics, people who worked in organizations thinking about culture and representation, students who were writing dissertations or theses on adjacent subjects. She replied to what she could and filed what she could not yet address and moved on. Constance had lunch with her the week the piece came out and said, without preamble, "You handled the question about the man very well." Which version of it? The one about residual feeling. You said clarity without strong feeling. That was the right answer. It was the true answer. They are the same thing, in your case, Constance said, which is one of the things I find most reliable about you. She thought about this as they ate, about what it meant to be reliable in the specific way Constance meant, not reliable in the sense of consistent behavior, but reliable in the sense of being someone whose internal account of something matched their external account of it. No gap between the story you told yourself and the story you told others. It was, she had come to think, the most important kind of reliability, and the rarest. She had not always had it. She had spent years in the gap, the small, habitual gap between what she actually felt about something and what she said when asked. Not dishonesty in any gross sense. Something more nuanced. The small adjustments people make to make themselves more socially intelligible. The softening of a strong view. The omission of the part that sounds too intense. The version of the story that does not make the other person uncomfortable. She had been in that gap least when she wrote. Writing had always been where the gap closed, where she found the true version of the thing and said it. The work of the years since the ball had been to bring more of her life into the kind of space that writing already was, to close the gap not just on the page but in the room, in the conversation, in the way she made decisions. She had not fully achieved this. She did not know if it was fully achievable, but she was closer than she had been, and the distance between the two versions of herself, the written one and the lived one, was smaller than it had ever been. She thought of this as her central ongoing project. Not the books or the essays or the lectures or the collaborations. Those were the visible products. The central project was this, the closing of the gap. Constance looked at her from across the table. You're thinking. I am. Loudly. Sorry. Don't apologize, Constance said. I'd rather have you thinking than maintaining a surface. It's one of the reasons I find these lunches worthwhile. She smiled. What are the others? The food here is very good, Constance said. And you are one of the few people of my acquaintance who tells me when I'm wrong, which I value despite finding it inconvenient. When have I told you you're wrong? 4 months ago, about the chapter structure of your second book. You told me I was confusing what I found intellectually satisfying with what the book actually required. You were correct. I revised my view. She did remember this. She had said it carefully but directly, the way Constance had always said things to her, because anything less direct would have been a waste of Constance's time and her own. I'm surprised you revised it so readily. I told you, I value being told when I'm wrong. That does not mean I enjoy it. It means I know its importance. A pause. At 71, you learn that the most precious thing anyone can offer you is an honest assessment. Everything else you can find elsewhere. She thought about this for a long time after the lunch. About what it meant that a woman of 71, with the authority and the accomplishment that Constance had accumulated, still held honest feedback as the most valuable thing available to her. About what it implied for the way Marguerite approached her own work, the degree to which she was asking, genuinely asking, for the honest account. She thought she was. She thought she had been, increasingly, since the night of the ball. The smile she had produced in that moment, the smile from below the surface, had been, among other things, a refusal to pretend that what was happening was acceptable, a refusal to offer the performance of being fine, a refusal of the gap. She had been doing that work more and more, in small and large ways, ever since. Francis Webb called her that same week with an unexpected proposal. Francis had been working, for the past year, on something she had mentioned only briefly at their occasional meetings, a program for young women in secondary schools in the city, aimed at building what Francis called practical confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from affirmation or from being told you are capable. Francis was skeptical of that approach, as was Marguerite, but the kind that comes from doing real things and finding out that you can. The program needed a writer, not to write content for the program but to work with the young women on their own writing, to give them the experience of finding what was true in themselves and saying it precisely, which was the foundation of every other kind of confidence Francis was trying to build. You'd come in once a month, Francis said, 6 girls at a time, from 14 to 16. You'd run a session on writing, not creative writing in the school sense, the other kind, the honest kind. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. She thought about her own experience of that age, the secondary school in Weston. The teacher, Mr. Holt, who had told her she had a gift for seeing what things actually meant beneath what they appeared to mean. She thought about what that comment had done, how it had been, in some quiet way, a permission, a naming of something she had not had a name for. What would I say to them? She asked. What you know, Francis said simply, which is how to find what's true and say it, and why that matters. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She would have been embarrassed to say anything else. The first session was on a Tuesday afternoon in February. She drove to the school, which was in a part of the city she did not know well, and sat in a small room with 6 girls who ranged in age from just turned 14 to nearly 16, and who looked at her with the particular expression of young people who are waiting to find out whether the adult in front of them is going to be worth paying attention to. She did not make them write anything that first session. She asked them instead to tell her something that was true about them that they did not usually say out loud. She said it could be anything. Small or large, important or apparently trivial. She said she would go first. She told them about the cold tea on her birthday morning, about sitting on the balcony and watching the street and feeling, without being able to say exactly why, that she was finally the person she had been trying to become. She told them this was the true thing she had not always been able to say out loud, that she liked who she was, and that it had taken her until her mid-30s to be able to say that without embarrassment. The girls looked at her. Then the girl on the end, the youngest of them, 14, with a serious face and earrings in the shape of small stars, raised her hand and said, without any particular hesitation, I'm good at maths and nobody knows because they don't expect me to be. The room shifted. The other 5 girls looked at the youngest girl with the expressions of people who recognize something they have also felt but not said. One of them nodded. One of them said, quietly, same but for science. She looked at the youngest girl with the star earrings and felt something she had been feeling more often in recent years, the very specific emotion of being in the right room at the right time, watching something real begin. Write that down, she said to the girl. The sentence you just said. Write it exactly as you said it. The girl picked up her pen. She wrote it. And just like that, as simply and as significantly as that, 6 girls in a secondary school in a part of the city Marguerite had not known well were in the process of learning the most important thing she knew, that the true account of yourself, said clearly and without apology, is both an act of precision and an act of protection. It names what is there before anyone else can name it wrong. She drove home from that first session in the particular state of someone who has done something that mattered and knows it. Not euphoric, she was not given to euphoria, but clear and solid, and pleased in the deep, unhurried way she had come to recognize as the feeling that accompanied work that was right. She went home and made tea and sat at her desk and picked up the smooth, rough stone and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its 2 textures, the way it was both finished and unfinished depending on which side you held. She thought, this is what I am doing. This is the whole thing. Finding the true account. Saying it precisely. Going toward the rooms that make room for it, and passing it on. To the people who are younger, to the girl with the star earrings who is good at maths and ready to say so, to Patricia's daughter in the Northern Library, to everyone who has produced that smile and filed the information and wondered what to do next. You take what you were before someone named you wrong, you hold it carefully, you make it into work, and then you give it away. She put down the stone, she opened her notebook. She wrote, Tuesday, 6 girls, A girl with star earrings who is good at maths. She said it out loud. She looked at the page. She wrote, "It keeps going." She closed the notebook and looked at the window and the evening light coming through it, and the plant that was now tall and fully committed to its angle, and growing steadily in the direction it had chosen years ago, and had never seen any reason to revise. It keeps going. She was 37 years old, and she was more herself than she had ever been, and she had a second book to finish, and a school program to continue, and a friendship with Constance to deepen, and work with Noel that would produce something neither of them yet knew the shape of, and a Tuesday morning every month in a room with 6 girls who were in the early stages of discovering what they were before anyone had the chance to name them wrong. She was not done. She was nowhere near done. She was, in fact, just beginning. The second book took 4 years in total, which included the 16 months of active writing, the year of research, and the final year of revision and editing that was itself a different kind of writing, the writing that happens when you return to what you have made and ask, for every sentence, is this the truest version of this thing, or is there a truer one still available? Gordon read each draft with the same focused patience he had brought to the first book, and the conversations they had about the manuscripts were among the most productive of her professional life. He had an extraordinary ability to find the place where the argument softened, where she had pulled back from the hardest version of what she was trying to say, and settled for a version that was easier to receive, and to ask, without prescription, whether the pullback was a deliberate choice or a reflex. When it was a reflex, she went back in. Constance read 2 drafts. She was, each time, the most demanding reader Marguerite had, not unkind, but precise, with the expectation that whatever argument you were making was capable of being made more fully. Her notes arrived in emails that were long and specific and required sitting with for a day before responding. Marguerite had come to regard those emails with something between dread and eagerness, the feeling you have when you know something is going to be demanding and useful in equal measure. The dedication of the second book was, again, to Elaine. Not because she had run out of other options, she had many people she might have dedicated books to at this point, but because the second book was about transmission, and Elaine was the beginning of the line. It seemed not just appropriate but necessary. She called her mother to tell her before the book came out. Elaine was quiet for a moment on the phone, then said, "Again? Again. You don't have to keep dedicating things to me. I know. There are other people. There are. And I might dedicate things to some of them. But this one is yours." Another pause. "What's it about? What gets passed down?" Marguerite said. "From mother to daughter and across the generations. What you carry forward without meaning to, and what you carry forward deliberately, and how you know the difference." A long pause. Then Elaine said, in the tone she used for things she felt deeply and was not going to expand on, "That sounds right. Mum? Yes. You did it right. I want you to know I know that." She could hear Elaine breathing. She could picture her at the kitchen table in Weston, the table with the uneven leg, the morning light coming through the window above the sink, the small collection of photographs along the windowsill that included one of Marguerite at 7 years old in a yellow coat, grinning with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who does not yet know how complicated joy becomes. "I know you know," Elaine said finally. "You've been showing me for years." They said goodbye in the way they always did. Brief, warm, without ceremony. The love implicit in the shortness rather than the length because they had been saying it this way so long, that the shorthand carried everything. She put down the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of her flat, thinking about transmission, about the yellow coat in the photograph, about packed lunches on kitchen counters, about a coat purchased new for a book launch, about the specific way Elaine had said, "I tried to make sure the floor was solid." She picked up her pen and wrote one more time in her notebook, on the page where she had been collecting lines from the 4-year journey of making the second book. She made the floor solid. "I stood on it. I built." The second book was published on a morning in October. She did not hold a launch event. She had thought about it and decided that the second book did not want a party. The first book had wanted a party because the first book had been arriving, in some sense, from the other side of the decision, from the aftermath of the ball, the year of building, the energy of having come through something. The second book was different. It was quieter and denser, and it required, she felt, a quieter entry into the world. Instead of a launch, she went to the school in the part of the city she now knew well. It was a Tuesday. She had arranged her session to fall on the publication day deliberately, not as a symbolic gesture, but because she had thought about where she would most want to be, and had arrived at a clear answer. She wanted to be in that room with the girls. There were 12 of them now. The program had expanded over the 2 years she had been running it. The youngest was 13. The oldest was nearly 17. The girl with the star earrings, whose name was Iris, which Marguerite had not said until now because she had been protecting it, keeping it for this moment, was now 16, and writing with a precision and an honesty that had made Marguerite, reading her work over the previous year, feel the particular emotion of recognizing in someone else the thing you have spent your whole life trying to do. Iris had written a piece the previous month about her grandmother, who had come to England from Jamaica 40 years ago and who had worked for 20 years in a hospital where certain people had consistently not seen what she was. The piece was not angry. It was clear and precise, and it named what it named without apology and without excess. Reading it had made Marguerite think of her own essay, 4 years old now, and how she had produced something similar, and what it had cost, and what it had opened, and what it might open for Iris. She did not tell Iris this. She gave her the feedback the work deserved, specific, honest, pointing to what was already strong and what could be stronger. She trusted the work to do its own work. That was what it was for. She arrived at the school on the October morning the book came out, carrying a copy for each of the 12 girls, which she had brought from the box her publisher had sent. She did not make a speech about the book. She handed out the copies at the start of the session and said, "This is what I made, and making it is what I was doing while we were doing this together. You are part of why it exists." Iris looked at the book for a moment. Then she looked up at Marguerite and said, with the directness that had been present from the first session, that directness that Marguerite now recognized as one of Iris's fundamental qualities, and that she had watched become more rather than less pronounced over 2 years, "Is there anything in here about us?" Marguerite looked at her. "Not directly," she said. "You came after the book, but the chapter about transmission, about what gets passed on, was written in the same period as these sessions, and you were part of my thinking while I wrote it. So in that sense, yes, you're in it." Iris nodded once, the way she nodded when she accepted something as factually accurate. "Good," she said. She looked down at the cover. "I'll read it when I get home." She drove home in the afternoon. She parked the car and walked upstairs and put her key in her door and went inside and stood in the familiar quiet of her flat for a moment. The day had been long, good and long. The book was in the world. The girls had the copies. Iris was going to read it tonight. She went to the desk. The stone was there. The photograph was there. The notebook was there. The plant was there, still leaning, even taller now, its angle committed and unrevised. She picked up the smooth rough stone and held it for a moment, turned it from one side to the other, the smooth and the rough, the finished and the still being made. She put it down. She opened the notebook to a new page, blank and white. She looked at it. She thought about Iris going home tonight to read the book. She thought about Patricia's daughter in the Northern Library. She thought about Constance at 71 with her list of things still to accomplish, and Noel in his studio making things that held their breath in the right places, and Francis building the program that was giving 12 girls the experience of saying the true thing out loud, and finding it did not destroy them but clarified them. She thought about her mother and the floor that had been solid, and the standing she had done on it, and the building that had followed. She thought about a night 4 years ago at a ball, and a man she would probably never think about again after today, and a phrase that had been a key turning a lock that was already almost open, and what had come after the lock opened. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. She would always have work to do. The work was not going to end, because the thing she was working on, the closing of the gap, the true account, the passing on of the certainty rather than the difficulty, was not a project with a finish line. It was a practice, a daily practice, like the cup of tea in the morning, and the walk when she needed to think, and the notebook on the desk where she wrote down what was true. She wrote one line. The last line she would write in this notebook. She could feel that it was the last page, not from counting but from the particular sense you develop after years of notebooks for when one is complete. The line was, "And so the next morning begins." She looked at it. Then she closed the notebook, put it with the others on the shelf where she kept them in order, and took a new one from the drawer. She opened it to the first page. She wrote the date at the top. She paused. She looked out of the window at the October city, the trees in the street giving their last color before the winter stripped them, the light going low and gold the way it only does in autumn, the ordinary movement of the street below, a man with a bag, a woman on a phone, a child being lifted over a puddle by someone who was probably their father. Ordinary, true, entirely itself. She looked at the blank first page of the new notebook. She wrote the first word of whatever was coming next. 5 years after the ball, Marguerite Slade was invited to give a talk at an event she had never heard of, in a medium-sized city in the Midlands, hosted by an organization she had to look up. The organization ran workshops for women who had left abusive situations and were rebuilding their lives. The workshops focused on practical skills, financial literacy, job applications, legal navigation. They had, 3 years earlier, added a writing component, because one of the volunteers had suggested it, and it had turned out to matter more than anyone had anticipated. The invitation was the simplest she had received since becoming publicly known. A single paragraph in an email, no flattery, no attached promotional materials. We run writing workshops for women starting over, and we think your work is relevant to what they are doing. Would you be willing to come and speak? She wrote back the same day and said yes. She went on a Saturday in November. The city was cold and gray in the specific way of Midland cities in November, which is a gray that is somehow more honest than other kinds of gray. The organization's building was a converted house on a quiet street, not impressive from the outside, functional and tidy from the inside, with a room at the back that served as the workshop space. There were 8 women in the room when she arrived, ranging in age from what appeared to be early 20s to mid-60s. They sat in a rough circle of mismatched chairs and looked at her with the particular expression she had been learning to recognize in the sessions with Iris and the schoolgirls, the waiting expression of people who are reserving judgment and have good reasons to do so. She did not give them a talk. She had decided on the drive there that a talk was not what this room needed. She sat down in the circle and said, "Tell me where you are right now." A pause. Then one of the women, mid-40s, with the quiet, precise manner of someone who has recently come through something very difficult and is still finding the edges of the person who came through it, said, "Starting again, from almost nothing." Marguerite nodded. "What does almost nothing feel like?" The woman looked at her. "Like everything you knew about yourself has been questioned so many times you're not sure what was true and what you were told." The room was quiet. "That's it," Marguerite said. "That is exactly the thing we're going to work on today." She spent 3 hours with them. She had brought paper and pens, simple ones, because the writing she wanted to do with them was the kind that did not require anything except a surface and the willingness to say the true thing. She asked them to write, not sentences designed for anyone else's reading, not polished prose, but the raw version of what they actually knew about themselves, the things that had been there before the difficulty, the things that had persisted through it, the things they could see now, at a distance, that they had not been able to see from inside. One woman wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, and then looked up and said, with the expression of someone who has just found something they had mislaid for a very long time, "I forgot that I'm funny. Genuinely funny. I forgot I had that." Marguerite looked at her. "Say that again," she said, "but as a sentence about yourself." The woman thought for a moment. Then, "I am genuinely funny." "Yes," Marguerite said. "Write that at the top of the page. Everything else you write today is evidence for that sentence." This was how the morning went. She asked and they wrote, and then she asked them to say it out loud, just the sentence, the true thing, in front of the other women. Some said it quietly. One said it with something that was close to defiance, the way you say something when you have been forbidden from believing it for a long time, and saying it aloud is its own kind of reclaiming. At the end of the 3 hours, the woman who had spoken first, the one who said everything she knew about herself had been questioned, said, in the deliberate way of someone being careful with precision, "I want to keep doing this." "You will," Marguerite said. "That's what the workshops are for." "No," the woman said. "I mean, I want to keep doing what we did today, the writing, the saying it out loud. I want to do that." The volunteer who ran the writing workshops was a young woman named Grace, who had been sitting at the edge of the circle all morning, participating when she felt it was right and stepping back when it was not. Grace had the quality of someone who understood that good facilitation meant knowing when to be invisible, and she was very good at it. After the women had gone and Marguerite was putting on her coat, Grace said, "That was the best session we've had since the writing component started." "How long have you been running it?" 3 years, weekly, since I read your essay actually. That's what made me think writing was the right component to add." She paused. "The essay about the room that knows your name. The part about what happens when you say the true thing out loud and find it doesn't destroy you." Marguerite looked at her. 3 years ago. 3 years ago. She thought about the chain of it. The ball had been 5 years ago. The essay had been 4. And 3 years ago, in a converted house in a Midland city she had never visited, a young woman named Grace had read it and drawn a direct line from what it said to 8 women in a circle of mismatched chairs who were finding their way back to what they had been before someone tried to name them wrong. "Thank you," she said to Grace. "For what?" "For drawing the line from the essay to here, for understanding what it was for and using it." Grace looked at her with an expression that was slightly surprised, the expression of someone who had not expected to be thanked for something they considered obvious. It seemed clear what it was for, she said simply. She drove home from the Midlands in the early evening. The motorway was the usual thing, the particular trance of a long motorway drive, the lanes and the lights and the occasional drama of a lorry overtaking another lorry, at a pace that made no logical sense. She listened to music for a while and then turned it off and drove in the quiet. She thought about what had happened in that room. Not analysis, she was done with analysis of it for the moment, just letting it be there. Letting the reality of it exist without immediately making it into something she had learned from, or something she could use. Just 8 women, a circle of chairs, the way one of them had said, "I am genuinely funny," with something close to defiance. Just that, just real. She arrived back in the city as the dark was full and the streets were lit. She parked and went upstairs and made tea and sat at the kitchen table where she had sat 5 years ago the morning after the ball, with her cold tea and her notebook and the decision she had not quite made yet. She thought about what the 5 years had built. She tried to count it and then stopped, because counting was not the right mode for this kind of accounting. You did not count the people. You did not count the sessions or the pieces published, or the rooms entered or the rooms declined. You simply asked, is the work real? Is it going where it should? The answers were yes, and yes. She thought about something Constance had said at their most recent lunch, on the subject of legacy, a subject Marguerite generally found uncomfortable because of its tendency to make things sound more final than she intended. Constance had said, with the precision she always brought to things she had thought carefully about, the mistake people make about legacy is thinking it's about being remembered. It's about what keeps moving after you've passed it on. The things that were alive before you and will be alive after you, that you were simply responsible for a while. She had not replied to this immediately. She had sat with it through the rest of the lunch and the walk afterward, and a long session with the second book manuscript that evening, and a night of sleep and most of the following morning. And what she had arrived at in the clear light of the day after was this. What Constance was describing was exactly what the school sessions and the Midlands women and Patricia's daughter and Grace's writing program all had in common. It was the transmission that moved through and past any individual contribution. It was the certainty, not the difficulty. The thing that gets passed on. She had been a part of that chain for 5 years, actively, deliberately a part of it, since the morning with the cold tea and the decision, but she had been a part of it for much longer, without knowing it, since her grandmother had walked into rooms with the certain step of someone who had decided something irrevocable, since Elaine had made the floor solid by the daily practice of it, since a teacher in Weston had said to a 15-year-old who was still figuring out what she was, "You have a gift for seeing what things mean beneath what they appear to mean." All of those were links in the chain. She was one more link. Iris would be another. The woman who was genuinely funny would be another. Grace and her weekly writing sessions would be another. The chain was not something you finished. It was something you maintained. You took what you had been given, the certainty, or the version of it you had earned through the work of believing it under conditions that discouraged belief, and you passed it forward, to whoever was next in the circle of chairs. She opened her notebook. She looked at the blank page. She did not write anything for a long moment. She sat with the blank page and the evening quiet of the flat and the sound of the city outside, the very ordinary sound of people moving through their ordinary lives, extraordinary on the inside, indistinguishable from one another from a distance. She thought about a ball, a room, a man, a phrase so careless he had forgotten it before he had finished saying it, a smile from below the surface, a cup of cold tea on a birthday morning, a decision made in the quiet of a flat exactly like this one, at a table exactly like this one, by a woman who had spent 34 years learning to be exactly herself. She thought about everything the decision had set in motion, the essay and the book and the second book and the collaboration and the friendship with Constance and the sessions at the school and the 3 hours in a circle of mismatched chairs with 8 women who were finding their way back to what they had known about themselves before. She thought about what came next. She did not know what came next. She had learned, over 5 years of following the direction she had set in that decision, that the not knowing was not a problem. It was the condition of the work. You made the thing that was in front of you, and you trusted that the next thing would become clear, and it always had. She picked up her pen. She wrote, at the top of the page, not a line of the book or a sentence from the essay or the name of a girl or a woman or a project, but something simpler and more fundamental, something she had known for a long time and had been saying, in different ways, in every piece she had ever written. I was here. I was real. I saw clearly. I said what I saw. She looked at the line. It was the whole thing in 4 sentences. The whole life. The whole practice. The whole project. It was what her grandmother had done, and what Elaine had done, and what Marguerite had done, and what Iris was beginning to do, and what the woman in the circle who was genuinely funny was going to do, and what Grace was doing every week in the converted house in the Midland city, and what Patricia's daughter had done when she asked, "So it's a thing that gets passed on." It was what was worth passing on. Not the difficulty, the certainty. Not the rooms that did not see you. The knowledge that you were real before they looked, during their looking, and after they had looked away and moved on. She was real. She had always been real. She had spent 5 years becoming more rigorously and completely and publicly real, in the work and the decisions and the rooms chosen, and the rooms declined. She would spend however many more years remained to her doing the same, and then she would pass it forward, and it would continue. She put down the pen. She sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at this hour. The evening traffic thinning, the lights in windows, the particular low hum of a large collection of lives being lived simultaneously, each one private and entire and carrying, whether it knew it or not, the accumulated transmission of everything that had come before it, and everything it would pass on. She thought about Lord Ashfield, not with anger or with gratitude or with any of the feelings people expected her to have about someone who had been such a clear occasion for such a large set of consequences. She thought about him with something quieter, a kind of neutral acknowledgement, the recognition of a fact. He had called her the other one. He had meant nothing much by it. She had smiled. She had gone home. She had decided. And the decision had been larger than either of them could have known. In that moment, it was possible for a decision made over a cup of cold tea to be. She had not come back to rooms like that one. She had built different rooms instead. Rooms that knew what they were looking at. Rooms where the conversation was real, and the work was true, and the people showed you, by the quality of their attention, that they understood what you were before you had said a word. She was in one of those rooms right now, the room she had built herself, in the flat she had made her home, in the city that had been hers for 20 years, surrounded by the objects she had chosen, and the work she had made, and the proof, everywhere, in everything, that she was the person she had decided to be. She stood up. She went to the window and looked down at the street. A woman was walking a dog. A man was coming out of the building across the road, pulling his collar up against the cold. 2 teenagers were sharing something on a phone and laughing. The same street, almost exactly, as the one she had watched on her birthday morning 5 years ago, when the day had moved forward without asking whether she was ready. She had been ready. She was ready now. She turned away from the window. She went back to the desk. She looked at the 4 sentences she had written on the blank page. She looked at the stone and the photograph and the plant and the notebook shelf with its row of full notebooks, years of mornings and evenings and decisions and work and questions and true accounts of what she was and what she saw. Then she picked up her pen. Not to add to the 4 sentences, they were complete as they were, but because there was another page after this one, and she knew, with the certainty that had been given to her and earned by her and that she was going to go on earning for however long there was left, that something was waiting to be said on it. She turned to the next page. She began. The 3rd book arrived differently from the first 2, not slowly, not in pieces. It arrived all at once, which was disconcerting, the way any unexpected gift is disconcerting, because you are not sure at first whether it is a gift or an apparition, and you have to sit with it before you can know. It arrived on the drive home from the Midlands, actually, not as a concept, not as a subject or a theme or a structure she needed to work out, as a voice, a specific, clear voice that she could hear so precisely that she had to pull off the motorway at the next service station and type the opening paragraph into her phone before it dissolved. She sat in the car park of a service station on the motorway with the engine running and the heater on because it was cold, and she typed the paragraph with her thumbs, slightly too fast and making small errors that she corrected as she went. The paragraph was the beginning of something she had not anticipated making, a novel. Not the novel of someone who has always wanted to write a novel but has been afraid to. She had tried fiction in her 20s and understood clearly why it had not worked. This was something different. A voice that was not hers but was made from everything she had ever thought about how a person sounds from the inside when they are in the process of becoming more fully themselves. The character's name came with the voice. She was 17 years old and she was not Marguerite. She was someone different, from a different background, with different difficulties. But she was working on the same problem, the same fundamental project, finding what was true about herself and choosing, against considerable pressure, to remain in contact with it. She sat in the service station car park for 45 minutes and typed on her phone until the character and her voice were real enough that she was certain she would not lose them. Then she drove home. She told no one about it for 2 months. Not Clara, not Constance, not Noel. She was not ready to have it be a real thing that existed in conversation. She needed to work on it privately first, to find out whether it was what she thought it was, or whether it would dissolve on closer examination into something she could not actually do. It did not dissolve. It grew. By March, she had 80 pages that she trusted. By June, she had 200. She worked on the novel in the evenings, after the morning work on the essays she was still writing, and the school sessions, and the expanding collaboration with Francis's program, which now ran in 4 schools rather than 1. The novel occupied the evenings, and the evenings became the part of the day she most looked forward to, which was a feeling she recognized from the early writing, from the days at the bookshop and the university, when she was still finding out what she could do and each piece of work had the quality of discovery. She told Clara in July. Clara was at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, as she often was, and Marguerite said, "I'm writing a novel, and it's good, and I don't want you to ask too much about it yet. I'm not ready." Clara, who understood exactly what was being asked, said, "All right. And, is it about what I think it's about?" "It's about a 17-year-old girl," Marguerite said, "who is figuring out what she was before anyone else got to name her." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then, "All right," she said again, and did not ask anything else. She told Constance in October. Constance's response was, "Will you show me the first chapter?" She had not been ready to show anyone anything yet, which she said. Constance nodded once and said, "When you are," and moved on to a different subject, which was one of the things Marguerite valued most about her. She told Noel in November, in his studio, where she had gone to see the new sequence of smaller pieces that he was preparing to show. He was standing in front of one of the pieces when she said it, and he turned and looked at her with the same expression he always had when she said something that landed, not surprised but attentive. "Fiction," he said. "Fiction," she confirmed. "A new material," he said. "What does it feel like?" She had been thinking about how to answer this, like finding a room that was there the whole time but that I needed to go away and come back to be able to see the door. He looked at her for a moment, then, "Yes," he said, the way he always said yes when something was true, as a confirmation of a fact, not a compliment. That's exactly what it's like. She had not known that about him. There was so much she was still finding out. The conversation between them, in its 5th year, was still producing things that were new, which was the sign of a collaboration and a friendship that had more ahead of it than behind. She found this quietly remarkable and quietly glad-making in equal measure. The novel took 2 more years. It was published in the autumn of Marguerite's 41st year, 7 years after the ball. On the cover was a single image, a window, slightly open, with light coming through at an angle. The title was the line from the character's voice that had come to her in the motorway service station car park, "What I Always Was." The novel's reception was different from the books before it, warmer in some directions, more uncertain in others, because fiction is a different contract from personal essay, a different set of expectations on both sides. She had anticipated some of the uncertainty and had learned from the years of practice not to let the uncertain reception in any direction become too important to her own understanding of what she had made. What she knew she had made was this, a story about a girl becoming more fully herself, in the face of considerable pressure not to, narrated from the inside with the precision that was the only thing she knew how to do. She had put everything she had learned about how a person sounds when they are working their way toward the truth about themselves into the voice of a fictional 17-year-old, and the result was, she believed, with the clear confidence that had taken her until her 30s to access, but which now arrived more quickly and held more firmly, the most complete thing she had done. Iris read it. She was 20 by now. She had been in the school program for 4 years, had finished school, was studying literature at the same university Marguerite had attended. She read the novel in 3 days, and then called Marguerite on a Monday morning and said, with the direct precision that was still entirely her own, "The girl in the book. She has the thing we've been working on, the thing you taught us." "What thing is that?" Marguerite asked, because she wanted to hear how Iris would say it. A pause, then, knowing what she is before anyone says it, and staying there. Marguerite held the phone. "Yes," she said, "that's it." "Did you always have it?" Iris asked, "or did you have to build it?" This was a question she had been asked in various forms, in various rooms and conversations and interviews, and she had different answers at different times. Today's answer was the truest one she had found so far. "Both," she said. "There was something there to begin with. There is in most people, I think, if they can stay close to it. But the building makes it stronger. The building is what makes it reliable." "How do you build it?" Iris asked. By noticing when it's there, Marguerite said. By writing it down. By saying it out loud in rooms where you're safe enough to practice. By choosing the rooms where you can practice more and more often, and choosing them over the rooms that require you to prove yourself before the conversation can start. Iris was quiet for a moment. Then at some point you can do it in any room. Yes, eventually. Even the rooms that don't deserve you. Even those, though you don't stay there. No, Iris said. You smile, and you go. She heard the echo of it, and she held it for a second without speaking. The girl with the star earrings at 14, saying I'm good at maths and nobody knows. Now 20, making the connection herself, without being told. Yes, Marguerite said. That's exactly right. They spoke for a while longer, and then said goodbye. She put the phone down and sat with the quiet of the flat. Her flat, which she had lived in for many years now, and which had the particular quality of a place that has been genuinely inhabited, not just occupied but lived in, left traces of, returned to, made specific by the particulars of one life. She looked around it. The plant in the window, tall now and generous and committed to its angle. The notebook shelf with its row of full books. The stone on the desk. The photograph. Her grandmother's earrings on the small dish. 7 years. 2 books, 1 novel, 1 collaboration, 24 essays, a lecture series, a school program in 4 schools, a morning in a Midland circle of mismatched chairs, a friendship with Constance Albright that had become one of the most important of her life, a working relationship with Noel Whitfield that kept producing new things, a correspondence with Patricia in the North, an ongoing conversation with Grace and her writing workshops, and somewhere in all of it, woven through all of it, the source of all of it, 1 cold cup of tea, 1 clear morning, 1 decision. She thought about Lord Ashfield rarely now. When she did, it was not with any of the strong feelings she had once monitored herself for. It was simply with the recognition of the particular function he had served. Occasion, key, friction, catalyst. A man who had not seen her, and had thereby demonstrated, with complete inadvertent clarity, that she had something important to do with the energy she had been spending in rooms like his. She had done it. She was doing it still. She was always going to be doing it still, because the work was not the kind that finished. It was the kind that continued. She thought about Constance's word, transmission. She thought about what would be transmitted and what was being transmitted right now, in the school sessions and the Midlands workshops and the readers of the books and the people who had found the essay 7 years ago and drawn direct lines from it to things she would never know about. She thought about Iris, 20 years old, making the connection without being told. She thought about what her grandmother had walked like, the way Elaine had described it, certain, even when she wasn't, the looking that matters, most of the time, because the certainty comes later. She was 41 years old. She was more certain than she had ever been, and the certainty came from the inside now, unmediated by what any room thought of her. She picked up her pen. She opened the notebook to a new page. She thought, there is always another page. She thought, this is the best possible fact about a life. And then she began.